Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. This is Thursday, April 23rd, and today we are going to get to part 2 of the multi-part series examining some of the most frequently cited rationales for Joseph Smith's behavior in his conduct of polygamy. These are going to be the rationales that try to put him in the light of being a righteous and worthy prophet rather than a mischievous adulterer or something like that. And we're looking at it through the lens of one of the most frequently cited and popular defenders of Joseph Smith, and that would be Brian C. Hales. And in doing so, we're reviewing a multi-part article series that is posted on the Mormonite Musing website, which is a website authored by Johnny Stevenson. And he and Jeremy Runnels collaborated a few years ago to respond to a lot of the criticism that Brian Hales had posted regarding Jeremy Runnels' questions in the CES letter. So today is, as you saw in part 1, things get pretty lengthy, so I think today is going to be a pretty long one as well, and we'll just kind of get through it. I don't even know if there'll be time for calls at the end, but this is really just so that, because these articles contain just really good evidence, but they're really hard to get through if you're reading them. And so this is hopefully a way where you can kind of put this recording on in the background and sort of listen to it, maybe follow along if you want to, because we'll show it up on the screen like so. So today is, again, from the website Mormonite Musing. Their choice for the title is The Irrational World of Brian Hales' Polygamy. I've titled this examining the rationales for Joseph's polygamy, because it's really the arguments that we're looking at. It's not so much the person. We're also going to examine the types of fallacies and ad hominem attacks that are originating in this exchange. You may see that they go both ways, and I'll leave that up to you. But try to get through that and just focus on the evidence that's here. All right. So, The Irrational World of Brian Hales' Polygamy, Part 2, by Jeremy Runnels and Johnny Stevenson. Part 2, Method or Madness? Man is certainly stark mad. He cannot make a worm, and yet he will be making gods by dozens. A quote from Michel de Montaigne, The Complete Essays. Madness breeds madness, a quote from Dan Brown from the book Inferno. Brian Hales mentions that scholars may critique your work. Some of Hales' own work was critiqued by historian D. Michael Quinn in 2012 and 2013, and what Quinn had to say about Hales' conclusions isn't encouraging. Aside from important weaknesses and incorrect arguments, Hales' work is full of red herrings, flawed methodology, and manipulation of the evidence. And it is important to note that Quinn only reviewed Hales' conclusions about sexual polyandry in Smith's marriages. But Quinn doesn't treat Brian Hales like Hales treated Jeremy Runnels. He takes what Hales has written and, step by step, makes his assessment. He doesn't claim, right off the bat, that Hales is being deceptive and trying to poison the well in advance. Still, Quinn found a plethora of problems with Hales' approach as a historian. Here are some of them. And you can see Quinn's full treatment, the full document responding to Hales, if you look in the footnote to the section we're about to read, and it's actually hosted on Hales' website, Mormon Polygamy Documents, or Joseph's Polygamy Documents. All right. From Quinn. Quinn accuses Hales of citing easily refutable claims. He quotes secondary sources over primary sources. Quinn also writes that the best evidence is the original record of sealing, not someone's century-later commentary about it, which Hales quoted instead of the original record in one instance. He cites that Hales brushes off the significance of some of the evidence he has cited. He makes contradictory assertions. He conveniently shifts his standards of evidentiary analysis in his own direction, that Hales' apologetic evidence, that he uses red herrings, makes claims that have no basis whatsoever, strain credulity, uses a presentist bias. Quinn accuses him of misrepresentation, of not consulting original sources, that Hales had an academic obligation to reveal certain information which he did not. He accuses Hales of using a vacuous red herring when Hales does not quote a single exception from the original records about which he writes, that Hales would not acknowledge crucial evidence that undermined his narrative, which was that Joseph Smith forbade the practice of polygamy in October 1843. He cited a source critical to his arguments without a page number. He used flawed methodology and a closed system of logic. Worse, Quinn's word, he failed to acknowledge several of the contrary evidences in publications he has cited. He makes perplexing gaffes in his use of evidence. He repeatedly questions the memory and accuracy of faithful Mormon witnesses that Hales disagreed with. He does not use equal standards for evidence of making apologetical claims knowing they were improbable. That he did not acknowledge critical evidence until forced to by Quinn. He gave an anachronistic assessment and a fallacy of irrelevant proof and chronologically false assessments. He overstates problems in proving a negative. Hales says you can't prove a negative, to which Quinn writes, for example, it is possible to prove that someone didn't die on a particular date. Falsely accusing Quinn of stealing documents. An absurdity, claims that Quinn said something he did not say. Another fallacy of irrelevant proof. Hales wrongly corrected an accurate page citation by Quinn. Knowing evidence but ignoring it to support his conclusion. Claimed no documentation existed when it did. Of not acknowledging evidence. Making claims that were wrong. Raising an apologetical smokescreen by questioning well-known facts. Making ridiculous assertions about conspiracies. Fallacy of irrelevant proof. Hales is an unreasonable researcher of using multiple fallacies. The purposeful absence of references. Purposeful non-inclusion of first-person sources that contradict his argument. Using imprecise and less detailed evidence to support his argument. Exclusion of evidence. Claims there's no specific documentation when Quinn provided it. Wrongly stated Quinn did not say, which was a stunning gaffe. Again, a red herring, another red herring, irrelevant statements, frequent use of polemical red herrings. This is just a list of the things that Quinn brought up in his responses to Hale's arguments on the subject of polyandry. On page 118, Quinn writes, nothing, and he capitalizes that, can satisfy Brian Hale's calculatedly stringent requirements that are impossible to achieve unless he finds a Victorian American woman who said, wrote, or testified that she, as a devout Mormon, alternated sexual intercourse with two husbands during a period of time. This speaks for itself. Also, Hales, in using the double standard of LDS apologists who narrowly defined acceptable evidence for unpleasant realities, of denying and ignoring evidence using a closed system of logic. For example, God knew Smith would be obedient, so he was. On page 124, Quinn compares Hales to Joseph Smith III, who refused to believe any evidence he did not like. He accused Hale of playing a skillful shell game in which premises for judgment are conveniently shifted so that the conclusion is always the same, ignoring contradictions and other problems in evidence, omitting significant facts, using wrong claims, does not cite sources he knows of, and making unqualified conclusions. Even with all this criticism, Quinn did agree with some of Hale's conclusions and even complimented him a few times in his critique. This is something that Hales does not do with Jeremy Reynolds. That is, to be fair, to acknowledge Jeremy's sincere concerns or compliment him when he agrees that he got something right. Instead, Hales goes from irrational to ridiculous. Before we go on, it's important to note that Quinn, though he's not a member of the church, still holds Joseph Smith in high regard as a prophet. He just sees him as a complex person who is not an idealized caricature, and so he's willing to acknowledge that he may have made some errors. Let's continue here. Let's see. All right, so Hales writes, Reynolds declares early that he has concerns about Joseph Smith's polygamy, alleging that three key facts remain unchallenged. 1, Joseph Smith married at least 34 women. 2, he married at least 11 women who were married to other living men. And 3, he married underage girls as young as 14 years old. All of Jeremy's observations are absolutely accurate, and Hales knows that they are, but here is how Hales ridiculously responds to this. This is Hales speaking now. Reynolds seems concerned that Joseph Smith was sealed to at least 34 women. It's actually 35 by my count. Now, Is it a bad thing to be concerned that Smith was sealed/married to at least 34 women? This concerns many people both in and out of the church. How, though, does this show that what Runnels wrote is inaccurate or that he is lying? It simply doesn't. It's obvious that Jeremy qualified his statements with the two words, at least. With all the other material that Jeremy includes in the polygamy section of Debunking Fair, one has to wonder why Hales would even respond to this, which is accurate based on the consensus of polygamy historians, including Brian Hales, for how many actual wives Joseph Smith had. LDS.org claims it is unknown. The Polygamy SMA text, note 24, is that citation. But you don't hear that from Brian Hales in this hit piece. Jeremy Runnels cites the many historians that disagree with Hales' count, but Hales doesn't mention this either. Hales then writes, while it, meaning the number of women Smith married, is a large number, it is important to note that at least 13 and possibly as many as 20 were non-sexual eternity-only sealings. As Joseph Smith taught, every woman needs to be sealed to an eternal husband to be eligible for exaltation. Lucy Wacko remembered the prophet's emphasis, a woman would have her choice. This was a privilege that could not be denied her. None of the women left any complaints regarding their sealing to Joseph, yet Runnels seems bothered by this observation. Hales' claim about non-sexual eternity-only sealings cannot be substantiated by any evidence that he presents, which he admits elsewhere. So his comment here to Runnels is curiously disingenuous, as is his comment about none of the women complaining. Many did, as we shall see. And late remembrances by women who are trying to justify spiritual wifeism of Joseph Smith should always be taken for what they are. First, Hales doesn't know if it is 13 or possibly as many as 20, and his claim that at least 13 were non-sexual eternity-only sealings isn't based on any credible evidence. He is simply making these numbers up. It is an irrational claim. There is absolutely no evidence to prove that there was ever such thing as non-sexual eternity-only sealing during the lifetime of Joseph Smith, which we will show below. There are only a few very late statements that are ambiguous at best and second-hand stories with no supporting evidence to back up Hales' claims. All sealings were for eternity or for time and eternity, depending on the circumstances of the individual, or time, but there is no marriage was specifically barred by ceremony or even alluded to. This is quite simply wishful thinking on the part of Brian Hales, and he has absolutely no credible evidence. There is credible evidence, though, that there were one or two instances of prearranged eternity-only sealings many years later between two living people, with the caveat that they would be unconsummated, but that they were extremely rare, and we'll discuss this below. Hales may be the only author who has published multiple volumes about Joseph Smith's polygamy devoted to the point of view that he was only sealed to a large majority of his wives that were specifically set up to be non-sexual marriages. This seems to be an obsession with Brian Hales, and the reason is obvious: to try and mitigate the damage of Smith's secretive marriages to other men's wives, which was considered adultery by Joseph's own 1842 First Presidency address, which is also discussed below. Michael Quinn put Hales' obsession with his idealistic version of Joseph Smith this way in relation to his denials of Smith's obvious polyandry. From Quinn, nothing, caps and underline in original, nothing can satisfy Brian Hales' calculatedly stringent requirements that are impossible to achieve unless he finds a Victorian American woman who said, wrote, or testified that she, as a devout Mormon, alternated sexual intercourse with two husbands during a period of time. Hales then writes at Rational Faiths, and this is in Brian Hales' piece on Jeremy Runnels. Runnels writes that Joseph married at least 11 women who were married to other living men. In fact, I count 14. He then goes on to name all 14. Like many authors before him, Runnels implies sexual polyandry occurred. That is, that the wives were experiencing sexual relations with both their legal husbands and Joseph Smith. Yet Runnels presents no credible documentation to support his interpretation. He does not address evidences that contradict it. Joseph taught sexual polyandry was adultery, and that a woman could never have two genuine husbands, citing Doctrine and Covenants, section 22:1 and 132, verse 4. Again, Hales seems to have missed Jeremy's use of the qualifier at least, and Jeremy would be more correct in doing so than Hales is giving an actual number. Hales includes in this list Mary Heron Snyder, of whom there is no evidence that she was ever a wife of Joseph Smith or even sealed to him. There is, however, evidence that Smith had sexual intercourse with her in her son-in-law's house, which Joseph E. Johnson, her son-in-law, likened to his own adultery, which happened years later. Concerning Mary Heron Snyder, Hales writes elsewhere, "Without any evidence, it is impossible to conclusively identify the nature of Joseph Smith's relationship with Mary Heron, if any special relationship ever existed." But this does not stop Hales from including her in Smith's list of wives with absolutely no evidence to score rhetorical points against Jeremy. This is another irrational conclusion by Hales because he claims that she was married to Joseph Smith, but that it is impossible to identify the relationship she had with him. But because she had sex with Smith, she has to be one of his wives, using Hales' logic. Johnson, likening Smith and Snyder's intercourse to his own adultery, still doesn't stop Hales from making these irrational pronouncements. Therefore, including her in his list of wives married to Joseph Smith in response to Jeremy is baffling, as is his obvious bragging about the number of wives he concludes Smith married. There is very good evidence, however, that Smith's relationship with Mary Snyder was an adulterous affair, just like the one with Fanny Alger. If this is what Hales means by the latest research, then his website should be visited with caution and his conclusions discarded for their flawed methodology and closed system of logic, to use the words of D. Michael Quinn. Hales also claims that Jeremy provides no credible documentation to support the practice of sexual polyandry by Joseph Smith. This is astoundingly untrue. Jeremy provides this statement by Anne Eliza Webb, one of Brigham Young's wives. From Webb. "One woman, Zina Huntington, said to me not very long since, while giving me some of her experiences in polygamy, 'The greatest trial I ever endured in my life was living with my husband and deceiving him by receiving Joseph's attention whenever he chose to come to me. Some of these women have since said that they did not know who was the father of their children. This is not to be wondered at, for after Joseph's declaration annulling all Gentile marriages, the greatest promiscuity was practiced, and indeed all sense of morality seemed to be lost by." End of quote. Of course, this is not credible evidence to Brian Hales because, as D. Michael Quinn observed, Hales does not use equal standards for evidence. According to Hales, Anne Eliza does not specifically name which of Joseph's wives she was allegedly quoting about the polyandry. However, her mother, Eliza Jane Churchill Webb, repeated the accusation in 2 private letters a year later specifying Zina Huntington as the woman. There are women living in Utah who are now sealed to Joseph while living with their husbands, and they say it is the greatest trial of their lives to live with 2 men at the same time. 4 months afterwards, she also penned, "There is Zina, whose maiden name was Huntington. She says the greatest trial of her life was to live with her husband and Joseph too at the same time." Although it is commonly quoted by writers as primary evidence of sexual polyandry in Joseph Smith's plural marriages, several problems emerge with Anne Eliza's statement. One is the issue of proximity. Anne Eliza did not live in the Lion House with Zina and Brigham Young's other wives, but lived in her own house a few blocks away. She apostatized in 1872 and subsequently sued Brigham Young for alimony and lost. Yet she claimed that sometime prior to her leaving the church, Zina Huntington confided to her regarding her greatest trial, her frustrations with polyandrous sexuality between her, Joseph Smith, and Henry Jacobs decades before Nauvoo. In the 19th century, for a woman to mention her personal sexual involvement was rare. To admit to a polyandrous relationship would be rarer, but to openly refer to a polyandrous sexual involvement would be very extraordinary. The listeners to such admissions would have no context to evaluate the declarations except to consider the behaviors plainly immoral. Even in the secret teachings of plurality in Nauvoo, no doctrinal foundation for sexual polyandry was ever discussed. At any time during the Restoration, such statements would be interpreted as admissions of unchaste behavior. Zina's alleged openness concerning such a delicate topic also contrasts her 1898 interview statements. She then remarked that it was something too sacred to be talked about. It was more to me than life or death. I never breathed it for years. She declared to the interviewer, "We hardly dared speak of it. The very walls had ears. We spoke of it only in whispers. You are speaking on the most sacred experiences of my life." In light of her declared reticence to talk about her marriage to Joseph Smith, it seems less likely that she would have suspended her discretion as reported by Anne Eliza. Importantly, in an 1887 interview, Zina questioned Anne Eliza's general truthfulness. The trouble with Anne Eliza was that she was not truthful. She was not grateful. She was a very bad woman. She has convicted herself out of her own mouth. She never lifted a finger to do a bit of work that she didn't want to do. She had servants, and there was no necessity for her doing anything. She had asserted that President Young opened all his wives' letters and that they couldn't visit anywhere or write to anybody, which is ridiculously untrue. President Young was occupied with too many important matters to give attention to such trivial things as his wives' letters or his wives' visits. We wrote to whom we pleased. Anne Eliza knew she was misrepresenting the facts. Zina did not dispute Anne Eliza's claims regarding sexual polyandry, probably because the original published statement did not identify her as the one woman, and few individuals, including perhaps Zina herself, would have assumed her identity. Regardless, it appears Eliza's assertion is best dismissed as anti-Mormon propaganda unless more credible supportive evidence for sexual polyandry is found. And that's the end of that quote from Hales. The first thing that we should mention here in critiquing Hales' assessment of Anne Eliza is that Hales accuses her of spewing out anti-Mormon propaganda, and so she really can't be trusted as a witness because after Anne Eliza left the church, a believing Mormon, Zina Young, claimed she was not trustworthy. To Hales, this is enough to give credence to Zina Young's claims and cast doubt on Anne Eliza Webb, who is just another anti-Mormon. Hales believes what Zina says about Anne Eliza and polygamy, but not what Anne Eliza says about Zina because it does not fit his idealistic narrative. The believing Mormon who says what Hales wants to hear is to be believed, while the person labeled by Hales as anti-Mormon is not, unless they agree with his own personal conclusions. And there is Hales using that anti-label again. It did not stop Hales from relying on Anne Eliza and her mother's testimony to support his claims that Fanny Alger was sealed or married to Joseph Smith. Also, he does not mention any of these problems, Zina's claims that Anne Eliza is untrustworthy, in an article he wrote about Fanny Alger because he uses Webb to support his position there. This is a hypocritical double standard that Hales employs over and over again. Hales then tries to tell us that because Anne Eliza apostatized years after she came to know Zina Huntington Young, Anne Eliza was also Brigham Young's wife for almost 5 years, that it makes it less probable that Huntington would have confided in her. According to Hales, since they only lived a few blocks away from each other, this makes it all the more unlikely. In fact, one of the points that Zina Young makes is that she wasn't restricted by Young from making visits to whomever she wanted to, but as we shall see, she didn't need to make any special visits to frequently see Zina. Hales also claims that he knows it is rare for two women who were married to the same man and were sister wives to speak to each other about personal matters involving sex. Hales tells us that, quote, to admit to a polyandrous relationship would be rarer, but to openly refer to a polyandrous sexual involvement would be very extraordinary, end of quote. According to whom? What is Hales basing this speculation on? There is no way to know because it is not based on any evidence in existence outside of Brian Hales' imagination. There is evidence that Hales is aware that one of Smith's wives had no qualms about explaining her polyandrous arrangement if she had the chance to do so in private. And this is a quote from such wife, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner. I hope you will not think me, Mary Leitner, intrusive. I am sure I do not wish to be. But if I could have the opportunity of conversing with you, John Henry Smith, and brother Joseph F. Smith, I could explain some things in regard to my living with Mr. Leitner after becoming the wife of another, which would throw light on what now seems mysterious, and you would be perfectly satisfied with me. I write this because I have heard that it had been commented on to my injury. I have done the best I could, and Joseph will sanction my action. I cannot explain things in this letter. Some day you will know all. That is, if I ever have the opportunity of conversing with either of you. Now, what could Mary tell them that they didn't already know about? Mary Lightner herself claimed that in February of 1842, Brigham Young sealed us for time and all eternity. What Mary wanted to speak to John Henry and Joseph F. Smith about was something that people had commented on to her injury. This would not be having two husbands, for many of Smith's wives were already married when they became wife, and they knew this. What would Joseph sanction? Staying with her husband? According to Mary Lightner, this is exactly what Joseph told her to do. So this was no secret, as she told Emmeline B. Wells years before this time. I could tell you why I stayed with Mr. Lightner, things the leaders of the church does not know anything about. I did just as Joseph told me to do, as he knew what troubles I would have to contend with. She had no problem writing this, but it would be very controversial if she wrote that Joseph told her to share herself with both of them. To say this was a non-sexual, eternity-only sealing ignores the evidence. But Hales doesn't mind doing that because Mary Lightner was having sex with Adam Lightner during this period and gave birth to a son in 1842 and a daughter in 1843 while she was Joseph's spiritual wife. What did Mary Lightner mean by becoming the wife of another? A simple eternity-only sealing makes little sense here. People were sealed to one another frequently during this period of time. Men were sealed to men, and women to men, and children to their parents. It's hard to believe that an eternity-only sealing to Joseph would have been spoken of to her injury, especially when it was established doctrine and taught for many years that Gentile marriages were not considered authoritative. Hales claims over and over again that polyandry was a practice that would have been explosive from a morality perspective and otherwise unknown in their society, but then so was polygamy, which the Nauvoo Relief Society denounced in 1842 as being contrary to the old established morals and virtues and scriptural laws regulating the habits, customs, and conduct of society. Yet, we have many women abandoning their 19th century morals to participate in polygamous marriages. And though some were reluctant to embrace the principle, they all trusted that Joseph Smith was teaching them correct doctrine because they believed he was their lawgiver. So how would Hales know what women spoke of in confidence or in private, or how rare that was? How is Zina Huntington openly referring to a polyandrous relationship when she's obviously confiding to a sister wife? Zina's comments about Anne Eliza after she left Young must be taken with caution for obvious reasons. Where is Hale's evidence that Zina Young considered Anne Eliza untrustworthy while they were both married to Young? That would help bolster his conjecture, but he does not produce any. This then would have been a private admission. Anne Eliza did not reveal the circumstances surrounding the admission by Zina Young to her, only that Young gave Eliza some of her experiences in polygamy, in which she recounted certain things to her. Describing this as an open admission is misleading and a red herring. These kinds of fallacious conclusions make up the bulk of Hale's arguments in his articles and in his books, as we have seen by the analysis of Hale's work done by D. Michael Quinn. It may be instructive to provide a little more of Anne Eliza's comments about this matter from her book so that one may understand their true context. From that book, Joseph not only paid his addresses to the young and unmarried women, but he sought spiritual alliance with many married ladies who happened to strike his fancy. He taught them that all former marriages were null and void, and that they were at perfect liberty to make another choice of a husband. The marriage covenants were not binding because they were ratified only by Gentile laws. These laws the Lord did not recognize. Consequently, all the women were free. Again, he would appeal to their religious sentiments and their strong desire to enter into the celestial kingdom. He often used to argue in this manner while endeavoring to convince some wavering or unwilling victim. Now, my dear sister, it is true that your husband is a good man, a very good man, but you and he are by no means kindred spirits, and he will never be able to save you in the celestial kingdom. It has been revealed by the Spirit that you ought to belong to me. This sophistry, strange as it may seem, had its weight and scarcely ever failed of its desired result. Many a woman with a kind, good husband who loved her and trusted her, and a family of children would suffer herself to be sealed to Joseph, at the same time living with the husband whom she was wronging so deeply, he believing fondly that her love was all his own. One woman said to me, not very long since, while giving me some of her experiences in polygamy, the greatest trial I ever endured in my life was living with my husband and deceiving him by receiving Joseph's attention whenever he chose to come to me. This woman and others whose experience has been very similar are among the very best women in the church. They are as pure-minded and virtuous women as any in the world. They were seduced under the guise of religion, and they submitted as to a cross laid upon them by the divine will. Believing implicitly in the prophet, they never dreamed of questioning the truth of his revelations, and would have considered themselves on the verge of apostasy, which to a Mormon is a most dangerous and horrible state, from which there is no possible salvation, had they refused to submit to him and receive his divine doctrines. Some of these women have since said they did not know who was the father of their children. This is not to be wondered at, for after Joseph's declaration annulling all Gentile marriages, the greatest promiscuity was practiced, and indeed all sense of morality seemed to have been lost by a portion at least of the church. Shocking as all this may appear, women that were sealed to Joseph at the time are more highly respected than any other. It is said, as the highest meed of praise which can be given, that they never repudiated any of the prophet's teachings, but submitted to all his requirements without a murmur, and eventually they will be exalted to a high position in the celestial kingdom. That's the end of that excerpt from Analyza's book. What Analyza states here is true. Smith did not consider Gentile marriages in his private teachings of any significance, and certainly not binding upon any individuals at that time, which was before June 1842. Smith also taught that in the pre-existence there were some promised to others, kindred spirits, if you will, to make it more convincing to the woman that they were meant to be together. Hales claims, time after time, that all of this must have been innocent because the husband in many cases approved of the arrangement. Hales writes, this is now Hales speaking, to answer the question why Smith married other men's wives is simply that the 14 women, again Hales' number, when they learned about eternal marriage, they chose Joseph Smith to be their eternal husband. It's that simple. They chose him over the men that they were married to. 4 of the women couldn't be sealed to their legal husbands because those husbands were not active Latter-day Saints. But the remaining 10, whose husbands were active LDS, chose Joseph. So some observations. It's kind of weird that a woman would be married to an active LDS but sealed to Joseph Smith for an eternal marriage. And Joseph could be criticized that he was insensitive to those 10 husbands, but none of them ever complained. We have no complaints from any of them. And there could be suspicions that Joseph coerced the women, but these are not supported by any kind of documentation. None of the women complained, and we have good documentation that Joseph taught that the women's desires should be respected in every case. And there are at least 5 cases where women turned him down, and the only reason we know about it is those women later talked about it. Joseph didn't talk about it. He didn't try to destroy their reputation. He didn't castigate them. He just let it go because that was their choice. That's the end of the quote from Hales. If this is a correct principle, as Hales asserts, then how would this kind of behavior be treated in church today? Women could just choose another husband and start living with him? Why would this not be a precedent today among monogamous relationships? What the woman wants is what she gets, right? How many bishops would counsel a woman who was dissatisfied with her Gentile marriage and wanted another married man that was Mormon to simply pursue him and try to break up his marriage so they could be together because she claimed they were promised to each other in the pre-existence, and not worry about a divorce since the marriage was not really legal or binding? This is simply ludicrous and doesn't make sense even for Joseph's time, which is why those like William Law opposed Joseph when they learned of his shenanigans. This also applies to Smith's behavior. It's obvious that Smith chose these women and then convinced them to marry him, claiming he could save them and their families, that they were created for him by God, or whatever explanation he could think of that would convince them, like angels with swords. He had neither the right nor the authority to do so under the very rules he claimed God to give him for the church to abide by, but since he was designated as the lawgiver and prophet of the church, everything he said, no matter how contradictory, was to be obeyed by these women and their husbands. As Smith's teachings spread that only Mormon men could save women in the afterlife, Some women were obviously persuaded to go after Mormon men, especially those in high-ranking positions who they felt had the most prestige and better chance of saving them. This was also the case with men and the law of adoption, which we will discuss below. Others, like Catherine Lewis, Nancy Rigdon, Martha Brotherton, Sarah Pratt, and Jane Law, were repulsed by the doctrine and rejected it. There was a good reason why Smith tried to marry women who were related to each other or were the sisters of wives of his close friends. He could persuade their relatives and friends, who in most cases were members, that helping him was the best thing that they could do in helping the family in the next life. That they, the members being approached about polygamy, also for the most part had a testimony of Smith's prophetic calling and would put aside their initial doubts and fears after Smith assured them that they were pursuing the right course. Hales acts like this is something unique, that if no one complained, nothing wrong was done. Once again, we have all of history to show us that this is simply not the case, that many are and were fooled by men to put their complete trust in, especially in religious matters. And I want to take an aside here just on this rationale, because I've seen Hales use this before. Well, none of the women complained, so we shouldn't have a problem with it. Nothing wrong was done. Well, in other religions where people leaving the religion have looked back on the acts of the founder of the religion and found things that they find completely reprehensible, they use the same argument. And there's one example in particular that I came across that I thought was very, very powerful, and that is the founder of Islam, Muhammad, married a child, a 9-year-old child by the name of Aisha. And people who are former Muslims bring this up as one of the things that they can't believe that they once made excuses for. And if you Google Muhammad and Aisha on YouTube, you can find a video with kind of the Brian Hales of Islam coming up with a good explanation or good rationale for why that relationship was not wrong. And so this is that video, and you're going to hear something very familiar.
The perfect marriage, and process was her husband.
Okay, let's see here.
She didn't seem to mind. In fact, she was very proud of it till the day she died. Wished to defend.
Okay, I'm sorry I'm skipping around here. I thought I had it queued up to the right spot, but we'll just start here.
People who wish to defend women's rights make this such a big issue when Aisha herself didn't make it a big issue. She didn't seem to mind. In fact, she was very proud of it till the day she died, that the Prophet was her husband. He was a very loving husband. They had the perfect marriage, and there really were no issues at all. This is actually pretty straightforward. It's a little bit of anthropology, and that is that people have different cultures and different mores. And
okay, so he goes on to make another one of Brian Hale's argument. There's probably a good comparison that we can do with that sometime in the future, but he, in that case, just made the argument that Aisha didn't complain, so there's no problem. And it's the same sort of argument that you can hear Hales make. So let's get back to our article. Let's see here. We're going to look at, there we go, boop. And there we are. All right, continuing once again. All right. Hales then tries to muddy the waters by claiming Zina's alleged openness concerning such a delicate topic also contrasts her 1898 interview statements. She then remarked that it was something too sacred to be talked about. It was more to me than life or death. I never breathed it for years. She declared to the interviewer, we hardly dared speak of it. The very walls had ears. We spoke of it only in whispers. You are speaking on the most sacred experiences of my life. Again, there was no alleged openness by Zina Young. These were comments made to Anne Elizabeth Webb that were private, since she didn't claim that the conversation was made in a public setting. We also have Zina herself admitting that she did talk about it. She says, I never breathed it for years. This is something that a person would only say after they had breathed it. If one does something and does not speak of it, then they say, I never spoke of it. If one does speak of it, then eventually one says, I did not speak of it for years. If Zina Huntington never spoke of such things, then why did she say, "We spoke of it only in whispers"? This implies that yes, Zina did speak of such matters, but only in whispers, in Nauvoo, and then again, years later, perhaps to someone like one of her sister wives, in private, not openly. Zina's remarks here are contradictory, and Hale's interpretation of them is contrived to support an argument based on his own red herring. Also, on his website, Hales claims that, quote, "In light of the contradictory evidence and the inability of historians to examine the described document, the credibility of this story is not established and should be quoted with caution," end quote. Isn't it kind of hypocritical of Hales to quote this interview with Zina when he claims that the RLDS church who published the interview doctored the Temple Lot case testimony and that they can't be trusted, and goes after Jeremy for doing so, but without it, Hale's claims about Zina Huntington fall apart, as do his criticisms of Jeremy Runnels. Concerning Zina Huntington Young, there is no reason to give credence to her declared reticence to keep totally silent about her marriage to Joseph Smith during the Nauvoo years, because there is a declaration that she spoke of it only in whispers because the walls had ears. It cannot be both. It was obviously to protect herself and Smith that she spoke of it only in whispers in Nauvoo. And this could have also been Zina's own paranoia. For example, this makes far more sense if Zina was approached by Smith early, like in 1840 or 1841, a scenario Hales rejects, even though Zina's own descendants affirm this. Later, when Smith was marrying more women, he was more open about it, as the testimony of Melissa Watt Wiles affirms. Smith also had many more wives who obviously helped Smith recruit new ones and support each other. Helen Mar Kimball claimed later that she was close to Sarah Ann Whitney, another of Smith's spiritual wives during the Nauvoo period. To illustrate this, in all her Temple Lot testimony, Melissa Lot never once mentioned that it was taboo to talk about her marriage to Joseph, which took place on September 20th in 1843. And she admitted to having sex with Joseph Smith. She also claims that some of her family attended her wedding ceremony. This is hardly someone who was worried that the walls had ears. For example, this is her testimony about being married to Smith. This is from the Temple Lot testimony. Question: Now, was this marriage private or public? Answer: There was quite a number present. Question: Answer the question, was it public or private? Answer: It was not very private. Question: Who was present? Answer: I can't remember all who were there. Question: Well, give us the names of the parties who were present as well as you can remember them. Answer: My father and mother were there, and several others, and they are all in their graves today but myself. Question: Well, who else was present besides yourself, your father, and your mother? Answer: Well, Joseph Smith was there. Question: Well, I know that, but who else was there? Answer: Well, some of my brothers, one of my brothers, and the witnesses that were necessary. End of that quote. Though Melissa Lot testified that Emma was notified, she was not present, so that was simply hearsay from Joseph Smith, who we know did not inform Emma of any of his marriages until he was caught and had to do. There is no reason to believe that Smith informed Emma about this one either. This, of course, is long after Smith approached Zina Huntington. Hale's assertion that Huntington's relationship to Smith was non-sexual is troubling when considering what Zina herself wrote later. Quote, When I heard that God had revealed the law of celestial marriage, that we would have the privilege of associating in family relationships in the world to come, I searched the scriptures, and by humbly prayer to my heavenly Father, I obtained a testimony for himself that God had required that order to be established in his church. I made a greater sacrifice than to give my life, for I never anticipated again to be looked upon as an honorable woman by those I dearly loved. Could I compromise conscience, lay aside the sure testimony of the Spirit of God for the glory of this world? End of quote. If these marriages were simply a ceremony for the next world, Huntington surely would not have felt that her honor was compromised, since the marriage would not be for time, but for the afterlife. Hiram Smith would later openly preach about being sealed to his first dead wife while being married to another in April 1844. Why would it be a greater sacrifice than her life to only be sealed to Smith in a marriage that would not affect her at all until the afterlife? Hale's scenario makes no sense. Yet, according to Hales, Zina was undoubtedly aware that the RLDS interviewer was trying to establish that Joseph Smith did not experience conjugal relations with anyone but Emma, his legal wife. An admission by Zina that her marriage was for eternity only and without sexual relations played right into White's hand by providing him with the exact evidence he was seeking. Nonetheless, Zina knew that some of Joseph's plural marriages were for time and eternity and included connubial relations. As a consequence, she may have been reticent to comply with White's designs by providing evidence he might have used to perpetuate a deception. If she was so savvy about what was going on, why does Zina demand to know of John W. White near the end of the interview? What is your object in quizzing me like this? Zina Young also seemed to not be able to make up her mind if she would married for time or time and eternity, which cast doubts on Hale's assertion that some of the marriages were only non-sexual sealings. When White asked her at the end of the interview, "Miss Young, you have stated that you were married to Joseph Smith for time and eternity. Now how could you marry Joseph Smith for time when at the same time you were married to Mr. Jacobs?" Zina does not correct White. Instead, she says, "I do not wish to reply. I only know that this is the work of God upon the earth." End of quote. This makes little sense, since it was known by many for years that Zina had been one of Joseph Smith's plural wives. White even gives her the perfect opportunity to do so, but she declines. Why would she have so much trouble in speaking about what was only, according to Hales, an eternity-only, non-sexual sealing that took place decades earlier and was well known by the public? After all, she had been a polygamous wife to Brigham Young for decades. Common sense tells us that this was more than just a non-sexual sealing. Another thing to think about is that Zina did not want to give White exactly what he wanted because it would have been a lie. I have to pause here because Yu-Gi-Oh wants let out of the room. He's sick of listening to me. All right, Utes. Okay. And continuing. Instead, we see that Zina's attitude towards anyone asking her questions about her polygamous marriage to Smith was hostile. She herself claimed that, "I never anticipated again to be looked upon as an honorable woman by those I dearly loved." It is obvious that Huntington just doesn't care about White or his case. In many cases, these women only thought they would have to answer that they were Joseph's wives, which they were happy to do. They did not anticipate having to be cross-examined and resented it. Zina didn't really want to answer those kinds of questions and dodged most of them. Hale's speculations here are absurd. It would have been much easier for Zina to talk with Annalisa Young about such matters, for she was also a spiritual wife. White, an outsider, was asking her the very questions that she claimed were such a trouble to her conscience. Again, if this was not about sex, why was Zina so troubled by her marriage to Joseph? If it was secret and for only eternity and non-sexual, then how would her status as an honorable woman come into play, especially so many years after the fact? She had been a polygamous wife to Brigham Young for many years, as we had mentioned above. Why was the period she spent with Joseph Smith so hard for her to explain? The answer is because it was for time and eternity and involved sexual relations with two men simultaneously, just as Annalisa was told by Zina herself. Hales claims that there are problems with Zina's own family reminiscences. Because they do not fit the narrative he is promoting, but these family recollections agree with what Annalisa Young claimed that Zina Huntington told her. Hales would rather rely on the evidence from an 1898 interview given under hostile circumstances, which clearly shows Zina Young unwilling to answer even the most innocuous of questions without interjecting, "That is none of your concern," or "That is no matter." Hales will even quote this to rebut Jeremy's claim about Zina Huntington, even though he warns on his website that it is a suspect interview. Contrast that with Melissa Lott Wiles' testimony during the Temple Lott case. And from that testimony. Question: Did you have a room with Joseph Smith as his wife? Answer: Yes, sir. Question: At what place? Answer: At Nauvoo. Question: What place in Nauvoo? Answer: The Nauvoo Mansion. Question: At what place in the mansion? Answer: Do you want to know the number of the room or what? Question: Well, just what part of the house the room was in, if you can give it. Answer: Well, I can give it and the number of the room too. It was room number 1. Question: Room number 1? Answer: Yes, sir. Question: Well, who else roomed there? Answer: I don't know of anyone. Question. Where was Emma Smith at this time? Answer. I don't know. I didn't ask where she was. Question. Did you know where she was at the time? Answer. No, sir, I didn't. Question. Did she know where you were at the time? Answer. I did not ask whether she did or not. Question. So you roomed with him in the Nauvoo mansion in room number 1? Answer. Yes, sir. Question. Was that the house that Joseph Smith lived in, was it not? Answer. Yes, sir. Question. And you don't know whether Emma Smith was in the house or not? Answer. No, sir. Question. And you can't say whether she knew where you were? Answer. No, sir. I couldn't say where she was, and I don't know that she knew about me, for I did not speak to her. Question. What time was that? Answer. That I saw her? Question. Yes, madam. Answer. I can't tell you the time. If I had thought I was to be asked all these questions, I might have kept a note of all these things, but as I didn't know anything about this examination, I didn't. Question. Well, how often did you room there with Joseph Smith? Answer. Well, that is something I can't tell you. Question. Well, was it more than once? Answer. Yes, sir, and more than twice. Question. Well, that is something I would like to know. Answer. Well, there is something I would like to know. If I'm to be asked these questions, I would like to know if I'm to answer them. I have told you all about this thing that I know, and I can't see any reason in your worrying me with these questions, and I would like to know if I have to answer them. Question. Well, if you decline to answer them, say so, and that will do. Question. I don't decline to answer any questions that I know anything about. Question. Well, answer the question then. Answer. What is the question? Question. Well, I asked how many times you have roomed there in the house with Joseph Smith. I do not expect you to answer positively the exact number of times, but I would like you to tell us the number of times as nearly as you can remember it. Answer. Well, I can't tell you, as I think I have acted the part of a lady in answering your questions as well as I have, and I don't think you are acting the part of a gentleman in asking me these questions. Question. Well, I will ask you the question over again in this form. Was it more than twice? Answer. Yes, sir. Question. Well, how many times? Answer. I could not say. Question. Well, did you any other place room with him? Question. In what way? Question. Of course, I mean as his wife. Answer. Yes, sir. Question. At what places? Answer. In my father's house. Now, you probably figured out that I have one lawyer voice, and that's a Southern gentleman. And so you just have to forgive me for that. He probably didn't sound like that, but I'm just trying to differentiate the different people in that interview. Now, of course, Wills here is concerned with answering like a lady, but her testimony is not near as hostile as Zina Young's was. Hales has the evidence, but won't see anything but what he wants to see in it. A good example of this is with the testimony above. If one goes to Hales' website and reads it, Hales does not list the question numbers, so you have no idea that there's a break except for some small ellipses. So he leaves out much pertinent information about Emma Smith being in the mansion and Melissa Lott never seeing or interacting with her, and that she was frustrated in having to reveal intimate details about her relationship with Smith, even though she knew ahead of time that this is why she was called. She was much better about this, though, than Zina Huntington ever was, who was extremely hostile about it and refused to answer any questions with any real clarity except to defend Joseph Smith as a prophet. Zina was married to 2 men, while Melissa Lott was only married to 1. Zina's final, I only know that this is the work of God upon the earth, is really the only point she wants to make. From Will's testimony, it can be deduced that Emma Smith did not know the full purpose of why she was there at the mansion house, since, according to Wiles, the 2 women never spoke or met there. She saw Emma when she left the mansion house, but doesn't remember when that was, or after Joseph Smith's even doesn't remember when that was, and after Joseph's death, she even stayed with Emma for a while. This would not have been all right with Emma if she had known that Melissa had been secretly married to her husband. This is hardly an open marriage that Emma knew all about. What is interesting is that on another part of his website, Hales does provide some of the missing testimony of Melissa Lott, but does not include the testimony about Emma Smith. The testimony in bold above is all the testimony that Hales leaves out on his page on Melissa Lott Wiles, which is very relevant in getting a complete picture of her testimony. Hales claims to have the latest research, but tries to manipulate that research to his own irrational ends. Also, this latest research is scattered over his entire website with plenty of Hale's conjectures sandwiched between it. It is not a collection of evidence by topic that one can easily find and read, like the one here at fullerconsideration.com, without having to wade through Hale's apologetic speculations. Hales is hardly the person to be judging the correctness of Jeremy Reynolds' conclusions, how he arrived at them, or declaring deception by him, because as we can see, more than one historian has arrived at the same conclusions as Jeremy, something Hales does not address or acknowledge in his hit piece on Jeremy. In fact, Jeremy provides ample documentation to show that Hales' conclusions differ from almost every historian that has published major works on polygamy. Here is one example by Jeremy of a graphic which is included in a presentation by Brian Hales at a Fair Mormon conference. All right, let's see here. I had to close the door a little bit. Yu-Gi-Oh came back in. All right. And we can see this graphic with the heading of Did Joseph Smith Practice Sexual Polyandry? And you've got a number of historians under the category of yes, a number of historians under the category of maybe, and Brian Hales standing alone under the category of no. Hales then tries to bring out the same tired argument that Doctrine and Covenants section 132, the revelation on polygamy, isn't really about polygamy and that sexuality is not needed. He then claims that it appears that Runnels is unaware of Joseph Smith's teaching dealing with plural marriage. Well, we know that Helen Mar Kimball was aware, and she completely disagrees with Hales' forced presentist interpretation of section 132. Helen Mar Kimball Whitney, who was pressured into marrying Joseph Smith when she was only 14 years old, explains on page 7 of a pamphlet she published in 1884 titled Why We Practice Plural Marriage, that Smith himself established polygamy, and all who entered into it in righteousness, including herself, have done so for the purpose of raising up righteous seed. Whitney here admits that polygamy is about the mandate to raise up righteous seed. In fact, the entire pamphlet is all about this, because Joseph Smith taught that there are many choice spirits waiting to take mortal bodies, and this is how the bodies are provided for them, by sex and plural marriage. Even in Smith's Book of Mormon, it claims that if polygamy is commanded by God, it would be done for the purpose of raising up seed. You can't raise up righteous seed by not having sex with the women who you marry for that purpose now, can you? Only in Brian Hale's world is this logical or irrational. Even though Whitney claims that the only reason for polygamy is to raise up righteous seed and that all who righteously enter into it do so for that purpose, the conflict in her marriage to Joseph Smith was that initially she was lied to about this. It seems that it is Brian Hales who references this pamphlet in his writings, who is unaware of Smith's Nauvoo teachings dealing with polygamy, even though he has the evidence right in front of him. Michael Quinn has spent years in the church archives gathering and analyzing original documents that have to do with Joseph Smith's polygamy, and his conclusions are far different from those of Brian Hales. For example, Hales writes at Rational Faiths, quote, "The second woman, Helen Mar Kimball, was offered to Joseph as a plural wife by her father, Heber C. Kimball. I agree this seems strange and possibly unfair to Helen. Regardless, there is no evidence the prophet initiated the process, and Helen remained a strong believer in Joseph Smith throughout her life. Importantly, there is strong evidence the sealing was never consummated and no supportive evidence that it was. Joseph was also sealed to a 16-year-old, Flora Ann Woodworth, in a plural marriage that was probably not consummated. The pattern in Utah was to allow sealings to younger women, but not to live with the woman until she was 18. I believe this policy began with the prophet, but there is no way to prove it." That's the end of Hale's quote. Now, Hale's strong evidence is simply a series of conjectures that he postulates and has no way of knowing could be true. There is, though, strong evidence that Helen Mar Kimball had sex with Joseph Smith. Catherine Lewis, who is courted by Heber C. Kimball to be one of his polygamous wives and lived with the Kimballs in Nauvoo, wrote in 1848, quote, "The 12 took Joseph's wives after his death. Kimball and Young took most of them. The daughter of Kimball was one of Joseph's wives. I heard her say to her mother, 'I will never be sealed to my father,' meaning as a wife, 'as I would never have been sealed or married to Joseph, had I known it was anything more than a ceremony. I was young, and they deceived me by saying the salvation of our whole family depended on it. I say again, I will never be sealed to my father. No, I will sooner be damned and go to hell if I must. Neither will I be sealed to Brigham Young.' The apostles said they only took Joseph's wives to raise up children, carry them through to the next world, and deliver them up to him. By doing so, they should gain his approbation. This is a remarkable statement that has been discounted by those like Brian Hales and Todd Compton as having problems because it was overheard and related by what Hales deems as an anti-Mormon source, and that there was no doctrine in place about daughters being sealed to their fathers. Some have also claimed that this is hearsay, but actually it is not, since Catherine Lewis actually heard the conversation herself. Catherine Lewis did have direct knowledge that Helen Kimball told this to her mother because she was there and heard it. Then there is the case of Flora Ann Woodworth. Hales writes that her marriage to Joseph Smith was probably not consummated, but that is simply wishful thinking. Then that is the best he can do. So how can Hales condemn Jeremy for his own conclusions and call them lyings from Satan? As Jeremy writes, imagine you spend 50 years living with your devoted spouse, fully intending to be married together in heaven for all eternity, just like you've enjoyed on earth for the last 50 years. And then a prophet says he wants your wife to be his 33rd wife. So in the next life, you don't get your devoted wife of 50 years. Instead, you have to find another. Are we to believe that God actually commanded the prophet to do this? This is even crueler than having someone else have sex with your wife. What moral justification can possibly be made for marrying other men's legally and lawfully married wives? Most of them were good LDS men. Orson Hyde was an apostle on the Lord's errand in Palestine to dedicate the land for the gospel when Joseph married his wife Mirinda Hyde behind his back. Henry B. Jacobs was a faithful Latter-day Saint who served a mission at great hardship. Other men were likewise on missions for the church, giving their time in service to the church as faithful Latter-day Saints. What a wonderful reward for their service, loyalty, and dedication for the gospel. How would a married, faithful LDS man, even if he wasn't sealed to his wife, feel today if he were to accept a mission call only to return to find that Thomas Edmondson had secretly married and was sealed to his wife? Now, Jeremy is right to declare that Four Mormon is completely wrong in declaring that polyandrous marriages had little effect upon the lives of the women involved. 16-year-old Flora Woodworth was not happy having to marry Joseph Smith, especially when she had to deal with Emma's unpredictable fury. It seemed that Joseph Smith had given Flora a watch and that Emma saw her with it. Emma then confronted Woodworth and angrily demanded it back. The very next day after this encounter, Woodworth up and married a non-member of the church, Carlos Gove. D. Michael Quinn picks up the story from there. Hales also acknowledged that, and this is D. Michael Quinn speaking now or writing, Hales also acknowledged that during the week of her legal marriage to non-Mormon Carlos Gove in August 1843 in the nearby town of Warsaw, Joseph Smith's previously married wife, Flora Ann Woodworth, met with the prophet alone at William Clayton's house in Nauvoo while Clayton was intentionally absent. Hales argues in today's presentation that Joseph Smith's private secretary was too discreet to record these encounters if they were for sexual intercourse. He also sees significance in the fact that Clayton's journal did not refer to bed or bedroom for these solitary appointments of the two at Clayton's house. However, Clayton's journal referred to performing a polygamous marriage for the prophet, referring to Emma Smith's jealousy about Joseph Smith's polygamous wives, Eliza R. Snow, Eliza Partridge, Emily Partridge, and Flora Woodworth, referring to the prophet's suspicions about familiarity between his legal wife Emma and Clayton, referred to polygamous marriages of Joseph B. Noble, Vincent Knight, Parley P. Pratt, and Brigham Young, referred to the prophets performing Clayton's own polygamous marriage, referred to Clayton sexually consummating it 3 days afterwards with no reference to bed or bedroom, referred to his own cohabitation visits with this plural wife with no reference to bed or bedroom, admitted that I had slept with her, no reference to bed or bedroom, referred to her pregnancy, referred to what Joseph Smith said would be the meaningless punishment if they were exposed to public condemnation, and Clayton's journal referred to the birth of his polygamous wife's child as well as to its death. There is no basis whatever to claim that an alleged indiscretion on Clayton's part prevented him from also referring obliquely to Joseph Smith's sexual trysts that were scheduled for Clayton's house. Flora later said that she felt condemned for her rash decision in a reckless moment to marry this young non-Mormon, a remorse the 16-year-old girl probably experienced the morning after. 2 subsequent trysts with the 37-year-old prophet in Clayton's house on consecutive days showed how much she regretted marrying a younger man earlier in the week. It strains credulity for Hales to claim in today's presentation that it required those visits beginning 2 days after Joseph Smith had already met with her and her mother for him to inform Flora repeatedly that he was ending their own relationship. By contrast with what Hales asserts about her alleged divorce, Joseph actually ended his polygamous marriage with 2 sisters during the same year by abruptly informing them of the fact. Although he had previously roomed with Emily and Eliza Partridge individually, with whom he had had, quote, carnal intercourse, unquote, Joseph Smith didn't take 2 consecutive days in Clayton's otherwise empty house to tell a wife that their polygamous relationship was finished, especially if he had already announced that fact to Flora and her mother. Emily's candor, which was forced out of her under adversarial questioning while she was under oath, was as far as a middle-class woman of Victorian America could go in referring to sexual intercourse. More typical was the published statement of the prophet's polygamous wife, Lucy Walker, who married Apostle Heber C. Kimball after she became a widow. I am also able to testify that Emma Smith, the prophet's first wife, gave her consent to the marriage of at least 4 other girls to her husband, and that she was well aware that he associated with them as wives, within the meaning of all that word implies. Her opaque reference to Emily Partridge, Eliza Partridge, Maria Lawrence, and Sarah Lawrence, like Lucy Walker, who stated that her own marriage to Joseph involved sex, those 4 had married him during the spring of 1843, marrying him in September of that year. Melissa Lott said the prophet explained it to her that it was not for voluptuous love, yet, when asked decades later if she had been his wife, quote, in very deed, Melissa affirmed that she was. Furthermore, even Hales admits it seems probable that emotional and physical attraction played a part in Joseph's plural relationships. Of course, Hales is the one who knows exactly everything he contests must be totally spelled out, or he simply will not believe it. He writes, in the aftermath of her daughter's marriage to Carlos Gove, Flora's mother once again entered the picture, attempting to assist her strong-willed daughter. On August 26, Clayton wrote, Joseph met Miss Woodworth and Flora and conversed some time. Clayton's journal also reports 2 additional visits between Joseph and Flora at Clayton's home, occurring August 28th and 29. These meetings were undoubtedly to deal with the future of Flora's sealing to the prophet, as well as to consider the theological consequences of her rash decision to marry Gove. Joseph was positioned to judge and apply needed disciplinary measures, a process that might have included additional meetings beyond August 29 that Clayton did not record. So, that's the end of Hale's argument there. So Joseph Smith met with Flora and her mother August 26 and conversed some time, and then had to meet with her on 2 more consecutive days to iron out disciplinary details. First, this was one of Smith's wives. She was a 16-year-old girl that Smith decided to marry and add to his already large collection of wives, whom Helen Mar Whitney said agreed to raise up righteous seed when they were married to the prophet. This means that every marriage was expected to involve sex, both in this world or the world to come, period. There are simply no exceptions to this rule. D&C 132 does not allow for exceptions. It says, for they, meaning spiritual wives, are given unto him to multiply and replenish the earth according to my commandment, and to fulfill the promise which was given by my Father before the foundation of the world, and for their exaltation into the eternal worlds, that they may bear the souls of men. For herein is the work of my Father continued, that he may be glorified. That's the end of that quote from section 132. Why would this be any different for Joseph's spiritual wives? Hales has no reasonable answer to this, and no evidence that it would be different for any of his spiritual wives. Hales objects to Quinn's interpretation that Flora had sex with the prophet in those 2 days because, as Hales says, it ignores the moral, emotional, theological, and traditional values that were embraced by most Nauvooans, and probably Flora Ann as well. Those values would have universally labeled such activities as promiscuous. That she would have repeatedly engaged in such low behavior seems unlikely. And that's the end of Hale's quote. Yet Flora had no problems secretly and illegally marrying a man much older than herself, and doing so behind the back of his legal wife. This was absolutely considered by society as low behavior. So she was already engaging in it. She had no objection to meeting with the prophet alone. She also had no problem leading on young Orange White, who she didn't tell about her marriage to Smith, and who had to find out from Flora's mother that she was married to Smith after getting caught together by the prophet who appears to have been stalking her. Smith supposedly spies White and Woodworth walking along the street near his house, picks them up in his carriage, drives them all over town, and this conveniently allows Smith to question White. White also says that he had to give Flora a mild lecture for leading him on like she did. This is the person that Hales states had such impeccable 19th century morals? Self-proclaimed prophets throughout history have proved that they can easily compromise the morals of almost anyone. As Dan Vogel writes, quote, "There's more to historiography than simply collecting documents. You should know the difference between a strong and a weak argument and what is more or less likely. What does it mean in accordance with his teachings when Joseph Smith frequently changes his teachings? It's like saying the Book of Mormon doesn't teach a modalistic concept of the Godhead, or the lectures on faith don't teach he became a Mason in Nauvoo. These are all examples of the idealist fallacy because humans do contradict themselves and violate their own teachings. However, Joseph Smith may have had a way of rationalizing his polyandrous marriages. He did say, if it seems abominable to us. Next, your expectation that some of the dozen women would have complained about Joseph Smith's proposals is an attempt at an argument from silence. I say attempt because some women did complain. I can think of two, Sarah Pratt and Jane Law. You might issue your challenge to prove Joseph Smith had sex with his polyandrous wives, but do you conclude Joseph Smith only had sex with his polygamous wives for whom there is evidence? No. Why? Because you assume marriage includes sexual access. You only engage in this sort of special pleading with polyandrous wives because you personally find the notion abhorrent. Nonetheless, you didn't respond to my counter-challenge to produce evidence that Joseph Smith treated his polyandrous wives different than the other polygamous wives. You are the one with a theory, and this is Dan Vogel talking to Hales, you are the one with a theory that needs evidence. You are attempting to take advantage of a silence in the historical record and see how often you can demonstrate they had sex. That's the end of the quote from Dan writing to Brian Hales. Hales also writes that the pattern in Utah was to allow sealings to younger women, but not to live with the woman till she was 18. I believe this policy began with the prophet, but there's no way to prove it. That's a quote from Hales. Actually, that was not any kind of pattern, but rather, as Todd Compton writes, there are cases of Mormons in Utah marrying young girls and refraining from sexuality until they are older. And how many would that be? Where is the documentation by Hales to prove this was a common practice? Nowhere to be found. This is hardly a policy, and to even suggest that it began with the prophet, Joseph Smith has no evidentiary basis. Rather, the evidence shows that Smith did indeed have sex with his young wives. Though Compton says that the evidence for Helen Mar Kimball Whitney is ambiguous, we still have the statement by Whitney herself that the only reason women practiced polygamy was to raise up righteous seed. We can also have Catherine Lewis' recollection made a few years after Helen claimed that she was deceived about polygamy being only a ceremony, and that they deceived her, meaning her father and Joseph Smith. If Helen Kimball was to be some kind of token wife until she was 18, what was the great trial she spoke of? Not going to a few dances? Really? She would have backed out. It was obvious that she was not attracted to older men. After Smith died, she married a man much closer to her age, rejecting the offer of Smith's apostles to be one of their wives. There's also the letter from her father who stated that he and her mother seek your welfare for time as well as eternity. Heber Kimball also states in that letter, "You have done that which will be for your everlasting good for this world and that which is to come." Certainly, Joseph had lots of other wives that he would have needed to spend time with. Since men and women could be sealed at any time in the church, what was the hurry for Smith to have these women sealed to him, unless it was to consummate a marriage and raise up seed? If the marriages did not have to involve sex, then why would an angel appear to him with a drawn sword, as he claimed, to prod him into non-sexual sealings? Only in Hale's irrational world. Why would Smith have a problem with this idea? Why choose married women when there were lots of single women to choose from? Why arrange front husbands if it were all just for the next life? If God is just, as Smith claimed, then they would have been his in the eternity. Convenience for Smith, and who simply would have married anyone. Eternity, only sealings fulfill the primary purpose, then why would Smith ever have to consummate any of the spiritual marriages? To fulfill the letter of the law? Since when does God accept only token compliance? This is simply an apologist excuse and makes little sense, especially when Smith claimed that God promised to give him whatever he asked for. In fact, what happened to Heber C. Kimball himself cast doubt on the concept of non-sexual sealings, as his first choice to marry after being commanded by Smith was to choose older women that would not involve sexuality. As Helen Mar Kimball later wrote, quote, "When first hearing the principle taught, believing that he would be called upon to enter it, he had thought of two elderly ladies named Pitkin, great friends of my mother's, who he believed would cause her little, if any, unhappiness. But the woman he was commanded to take was an English lady named Sarah Noon, nearer my mother's age, who came over with the company of saints in the same ship which Father and Brother Brigham returned from Europe. She had been married and was mother of 2 little girls, but left her husband on account of his drunken and dissolute habits. Father was told to take her as his wife and provide for her and her children, and he did so." That's the end of that quote. Smith rejected Kimball's initial choice and told him to take a younger wife he could have sex with, claiming that such an arrangement was of the devil. We know this because Kimball had children with her, and Lorenzo Snow affirmed it. Heber C. Kimball's marriage to Sarah Noon was not a non-sexual sealing. Why then would Smith not be satisfied with Heber C. Kimball's first choice if this was all about eternity? As for the concept of non-sexual sealings, there is strong evidence that they were very rare and only performed well after Smith's death. This, of course, is disputed by Mormon apologists like those of Shields, who write in a review of Todd Compton's book, In Sacred Loneliness. This is now Shields reviewing Todd Compton's book, In Sacred Loneliness. In discussing polyandry, LDS leaders have claimed that Joseph Smith was sealed to other men's wives for eternity rather than time in eternity. Compton disallows this as implausible, noting there are no known instances of marriages for eternity only in the 19th century. While specific instances may not be available, Joseph F. Smith, in his testimony before the senatorial committee investigating Reed Smoot, said that he was personally aware of such marriages occurring until about 20 years previous. From that testimony, Mr. Taylor: "Living persons have been united for eternity, have they not?" Mr. Smith: "I think there have been a few cases of that kind." Mr. Vancott: "To what time, Mr. Taylor, do you limit your question?" Mr. Taylor: "I was going to ask him, how recently have you known that kind of marriage?" Mr. Smith: "Not very recently." Mr. Taylor: "Do you mean 5 years or 25 years?" Mr. Smith: "Oh, 20 years or more." Now, Joseph F. Smith's testimony in this regard is important in another aspect, for he stated unequivocally that sealings for eternity did not allow for earthly cohabitation. After Smith saying that it was possible to be sealed for time and eternity or only for eternity, the committee chairman asked about the possible rights of cohabitation between those sealed only for eternity. The chairman: "According to the doctrines of your church, did that carry with it the right of earthly cohabitation?" Mr. Smith: "It was not so understood." The chairman: "Then what is your—" Mr. Smith: "It does not carry that right." Since such a marriage did not carry rights of cohabitation in 1904, it is plausible that Joseph F. Smith was simply describing a policy that had been in place since the days of Nauvoo. Evidence that this was also the policy of Nauvoo is found in the one historical document, largely ignored by Compton, specifying the parameters of plural marriage, the 132nd section of the Doctrine and Covenants. This document came as the revelation explaining and approving plural marriage in an effort to justify Joseph Smith's actions and convince doubters. If his actions included polyandry, it seems very strange that the revelation does not address that concept. And that's the end of that quote from people defending Joseph, arguing against Todd Compton's book, In Sacred Loneliness. Now, there are some real problems with this argument, one of which is that Allred does not quote enough of Joseph F. Smith's testimony to give an accurate picture of what he really said. Here is the testimony of Smith that relates to sealings at the Smoot hearings. Okay, now this is longer. Mr. Taylor, do you have as many different kinds of marriage now as formerly? Mr. Smith: "We have as many different kinds of marriages now as formerly." Mr. Taylor: "Well, let me call your attention to what I mean because it will save time. Sealing for time only, sealing for time and eternity, and sealing for eternity only." Mr. Smith: "Yes, sir." Taylor: "Do you have those?" Smith: "Yes, sir." Taylor, all three of them? Smith, all three of them. Do you perform celestial marriages now? That is simply a marriage for time and eternity. Time and eternity? That is what that means, nothing more and nothing less. That, according to the civil or municipal law, is an ordinary marriage, is it not? Those that are married in that way outside of the temples, it is simply a civil contract for time. But where they have obtained these licenses and go to the temples to be married, they are sealed for time and eternity. Are their sealings still going on for eternity alone, not for time? Not that I know of, unless the parties are dead. Do you marry people for eternity and not for time? When they are dead, yes, sir. And then a different questioner says, do you marry them after they're dead? After they are dead, and, Mr. Senator, we do not have to have a license from the court to do that. That is simply a church marriage. That is just simply a principle that we believe in, that men and women are immortal beings. Are both the parties to that marriage dead at the time it is solemnized? Yes, sir, they are often dead, and they are represented by their heirs, either their sons or daughters, and some of their kinsmen. Living persons have been united for eternity, have they not? I think there have been some few cases of that kind. What time, Mr. Taylor, do you limit your question? I was going to ask him, how recently have you known that kind of marriage? Not very recently. Do you mean 5 years or 25 years? Oh, 20 years or more. Is there any rule of the church prohibiting that kind of marriage? It has merely fallen into disuse, is that all? It has merely fallen into disuse, that is all. I do not know that it could be said to have fallen absolutely into disuse. Or rather that the principle which still adheres has not been invoked or exercised so often. No, sir, it has not been invoked. Now, with further questioning, we learn, and again, I apologize for my accents. I'm just trying to distinguish the prophet from the other people. Mr. Worthington, you said you remember 2 instances where persons have been sealed by the church for eternity. You said 1 or 2 instances. Yes, sir, 1 or 2 instances. Well, how long ago were those? 25 to 30 years ago. Now, Taylor then wants everyone to understand what Smith is saying and further questions him. Well, just one question. I want to be sure that that I understand you correctly. You say that Apostle Teasdale told you that this wife from whom he had to obtain a divorce, that he'd been sealed for eternity only. Yes, sir. Well, that he had not been married for either time or time and eternity, but only for that third form, eternity only. Well, now, Mr. Taylor, I could not tell you as to the form of the ceremony. Well, I understand that. I'm not speaking about exactly. And therefore, the relations between them as contemplated at the time of the ceremony were that they should never cohabit. Never cohabit. Therefore, his relations with her were as chaste as if she were his sister or a stranger to him. Perfectly so. All right, so that's that part of that testimony. Now, with Smith's full testimony before us, a completely different picture emerges about these eternity-only sealings. First, they were performed almost exclusively for the dead, meaning that a living person was sealed to a dead one or a dead person to a dead person, since there would be no need to seal them for time. Second, in all his time in the church, Joseph F. Smith had only heard about 1 or 2 eternity-only sealings between 2 living people. Third, it is those 1 or 2 instances that Smith was dating. They were sealed but later divorced. According to Smith's testimony, these kinds of sealings were very rare since he'd only heard of 1 or 2 in his lifetime. Remember, Smith had collected as many affidavits from Joseph Smith's polygamous wives as he could in 1869, so he was familiar with those marriages and still claims to only know about 1 or 2 eternity-only sealings from living persons. In fact, they were so rare that Angus Cannon, who also testified, had never performed or seen one. Angus M. Cannon, who was the nephew of John Taylor, immigrated to Nauvoo in 1842 with his family and went west with the church. His older brother was George Q. Cannon, he also served in the mission field with John Taylor and was president of Salt Lake City Stake. It was said of him that he was without equal in the field of Reed-Smoot hearings. Cannon testified about sealings. This is a different senator who just sealing for eternity ceremony. Mr. Cannon, a marriage for eternity. Senator Overman, As different from a marriage upon this earth? Sir? Different from ordinary marriage. Oh, well, there is a ceremony for marriage for time and also for eternity. Are your wives sealed to you for time or for eternity? Time and eternity. Time and eternity, both, all 6 of them? Yes, sir. Are there such marriages as sealing for time and sealing for eternity, and some for time and some for eternity? I have witnessed many marriages in my time. I never witnessed any for eternity and not for time. Are there such marriages as that? I cannot say there are or not. Of course, there are marriages performed between living people and dead people by having persons act vicariously for the dead. There are such marriages, then, with dead people. That is necessarily for eternity. It cannot be for time. I say, do you have such marriages as that? Yes, sir. A living person marrying a dead person. By the dead person being represented by a living person. By having a representative here on earth, he marries a living person here. Well, yes, sir. Vicariously, the same as Paul spoke of baptism for the dead. Have you seen such marriages as that? Yes, sir, acting for the dead. That does not result in marriage for time between the proxy and the person who is married for the other eternity only, does it? No, it only relates to the dead. Do you recall any instances in the history of the church where the proxy vicariously representing the dead person has insisted that for the time the woman was his? No, I never heard of such thing. I would think so. That is all. Now, that's the end of that exchange. Thank goodness. Both of these men testified that they knew of sealings for eternity, but they had to do with the dead. Cannon testifies that he never witnessed a marriage for eternity between 2 living persons and could not say if there were marriages for eternity only for 2 living people. Joseph F. Smith, who only mentions knowing about 1 or 2 that occurred about 20 to 30 years before, which would be in the 1870s or 1880s, this testimony shows that eternity-only sealings were very rare between 2 living parties and not the norm. They were so rare, in fact, that an expert on church law had never heard of one. To claim that Joseph Smith participated in over a dozen of these without any evidence is wishful thinking, given the testimonies above. Shields, though, has no qualms about taking this testimony from Joseph F. Smith and selectively quoting to make it appear that these kinds of sealings were normal until about 20 years before the time when Joseph Smith testified. As for Section 132, Dan Vogel explains in response to Brian Hales about a similar apologetic interpretation of D&C 132 that Allred makes. Now, this is Dan addressing Brian. Brian, your reading of D&C 22 is anachronistic. You're attempting to apply an 1840s definition to an 1830s term. At the time it was given, only the Catholics considered marriage a religious ceremony. Protestants rejected marriage as a sacrament of the church. Mormons were no different. While they insisted that converts be rebaptized, they did not require them to be remarried. And then Dan goes on to quote, in Joseph Smith's theology, a woman could never have 2 husbands. That's a quote from Brian Hales, and now Dan is addressing that. You are presumably basing this on the July 1843 revelation, Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, verses 61 and 62. Yet, you have admitted that Joseph Smith married at least 3 women who had living husbands. So, to save your thesis, you propose the following ad hoc hypothesis. A marriage sealing in the new and everlasting covenant would cause the civil marriage to be done away with from a church standpoint. That's a quote from Hales. However, and this is Dan explaining again, this interpretation is aided by your anachronistic borrowing from D&C 22, which you haven't shown that Joseph Smith applied to marriage in the 1840s. Yours is a private interpretation of Scripture, since the church's position has been that non-Mormon marriage, or Mormon marriage outside of the temple for that matter, is valid and binding for this life only, but is dissolved at death. This is apparently the view expressed in D&C 132, 41 through 44, which mentions that it is considered adultery if either the husband or wife breaks the marriage vow, even if their marriage was not in the new and everlasting covenant. Indeed, the church has always treated non-temple marriage as legitimate. Dan goes on, nevertheless, you have only shown that under a certain semantic construction, Joseph Smith didn't commit adultery. There still remains the issue of sexual polyandry. In other words, you seem to be arguing two things simultaneously. Joseph Smith didn't have sex with married women, but if he did, it didn't consider it adultery. And you say I'm subtle. Polyandry is polyandry. The Revelation's use of the term virgins in verses 61 and 62 of Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, would tend to exclude your specialized definition, which would require you to go deeper into semantics and equivocation. It turns out that when you say everyone but you has ignored Joseph Smith's theology, you mean they don't understand it in the unique and unlikely way that you do. Given Joseph Smith's previous marriages to married women, D&C 132 is apparently Joseph Smith's repentance from polyandry. Under the definition in verses 61 and 62, Joseph Smith had committed adultery, but his salvation was assured as long as he didn't commit murder or blasphemy against the Holy Ghost. And this is in D&C 132, 19, and 26, 27 verses where it says, I seal upon you your exaltation. The Revelation warns not to judge Joseph Smith, quote, for he shall do the sacrifice which I require at his hands for his transgressions, end quote. It makes you wonder what this revelation is really about, doesn't it? Universal salvation was also part of Joseph Smith's secret theology. Dan goes on to say that Hales says, quote, there is no credible historical evidence for the teaching and practice of sexual polyandry in Nauvoo or afterwards, end of quote from Hales. Dan goes on, I say there is. What you mean to say is there are no explicit teaching, therefore must build circumstantial reasonable, which deserves the most respect. Historians do that all the time. Even in the most perfectly documented world, an imaginative apologist can always find a way to escape evidence. Rarely is there a decisive piece of evidence that ends debate. The most that can be hoped for is that an interpretation becomes increasingly ad hoc as it tries to accommodate the ad hoc nature of your position will become more apparent. Dan goes on to address another of Hale's statements. Hales is quoted as saying, Quinn has amassed a remarkable volume of alleged evidences, but none of them constitutes a clear documentation of the behavior. Not, Hales says, quote, and like you, he completely ignores the theology and the reaction of the alleged participants. That's the end of the quote from Hales. Dan says, what theology? The theology that shows Joseph Smith contradicted his own teachings, or the one that shows that he couldn't contradict them? You want Quinn to commit the idealist fallacy. We've discussed this. You don't know how the participants reacted. Hales says, quote, what we can document is that there is an important difference theologically. Sexual polygamy was acceptable and sexual polygamy not according to your definition discussed above. Again, you don't know that Brigham Young and John Taylor knew about polyandry, if they saw it as hypocritical or how they would have reacted. At what point do you start to question someone you believe is a prophet speaking for God and telling you to reject the norms of society? Being under the influence of a charismatic leader of a religious cult who is sexually abusing some of his followers is probably the clearest example of why the idealist fallacy exists. Humans aren't always rational and do not always behave in predictable ways. None of these followers possessed the qualities of Emma from silence. I understand that Orson Pratt struggled with the conflicting stories of Joseph Smith and his wife, nearly lost his mind, but finally decided in Joseph Smith's favor. That was a mistake. Joseph Smith's denials about Jane Law and Sarah Pratt are not credible. We know that he was willing to lie to cover up polygamy. On the 26th of May in 1844, Joseph Smith said, what a thing, adultery, and having 7 wives when I can only find one. Given the fact that Orson was so distraught over the incident with his wife, he intimately sided with Joseph Smith. Regarding Orson Pratt's opinion says nothing about the veracity of Sarah's claim. Neither does Bennett. Not only should those statements be read with skepticism, but law is more believable than Joseph Smith. In fact, Joseph Smith's version has a reputation for proposing marriage to Smith. Where did she get such an idea? Polygamy in public and trying to keep the church from disintegrating. That's the end of that part 2 on November 9th, 2014. Hales writes, in lauding the church's effort to explain this difficult topic, some may assume that in defending the essay we are in fact defending polygamy. We are not. On earth, polygamy expands a man's sexual and emotional opportunities as a husband, as it simultaneously fragments a woman's sexual and emotional opportunities as a wife. The practice is difficult to defend as anything but unfair and at times emotionally cruel. However, within the context of Joseph Smith's teachings, a few eternal polygamists are needed. This reality is routinely ignored by almost all critics who often declare or imply that libidinously, and it seems none of the critics of the essay do either. Yet this may be the greatest weakness of most of the critics' arguments. They are simply incomplete. Joseph Smith taught that couples who are sealed in eternal marriage, not plural marriage, shall inherit thrones, kingdoms, principalities, and powers, dominions, all heights and depths, and they shall pass by the angels and the gods which are set there, to their exaltation and glory in all things that has been sealed upon their heads, which glory shall be a fullness and a continuation of the seeds forever and ever. Then shall they be gods. He's quoting there from Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. A plurality of wives allows all worthy women to be sealed to a husband on earth and become eligible for these blessings in heaven. Any woman who is not sealed will, quote, ever. Again from D&C 132. Now, it's easy to denounce polygamy on earth, but for believers, the discussion should also include the importance of plurality in eternity. As described in section 132, it allows all God's children to receive his promised blessings by making eternal marriages available to everyone who seeks it. As the essay explains, Joseph Smith's revelation on marriage declared the continuation of the seeds forever and ever, helped to fulfill God's purposes for his children. Its value if they are able to appreciate Joseph Smith's teachings about eternal marriage. Without that understanding, they will see only an unjust earthly practice that is easily condemned. The fact that the eternal contributions of plurality have not been addressed by virtually any critic suggests that additional study on the topic might result in different critiques of this watershed essay. And that's the end of the quote from Hales, who is explaining that polygamy, if you just look at it as polygamy, is terrible, but when you include the theological implications, then there's something more to it. Now, Hales is absolutely defending polygamy, no matter how hard he tries to deny this. That's painfully obvious. Hales has definitely tried to refocus what Section 132 is really all about, which we discussed below. And only a few eternal polygamists are needed? Where does he get this from? Nowhere does the polygamy revelation stipulate this. This is simply an invention of Hales. He also tries to claim, again and again it seems, that Joseph Smith's theological teachings regarding plural marriage are universally ignored. Actually, they're not. Let's put this to the test with a good example here. Hales claims above that the practice of polygamy is difficult to defend as anything but unfair and at times emotionally cruel. If Hales, as he claims, understands Joseph's theology, then how can he make such a statement and reconcile it with Mormon theology, especially in light of this letter by Joseph Smith to Nancy Rigdon? And here we've included the entire text of the happiness letter, but we'll select those parts which are relevant. It starts out with one of the most famous stanzas. Happiness is the object and design of our existence and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it. It goes on to say later, unless, that we can't keep all those commandments without first knowing them, and we can't expect to know them unless we comply or keep those that we have already received, and that which is wrong under one circumstance may be and often is right under another. He goes on then to explain how things that may be wrong, if you do it yourself, can be right if God commands it, and then later, in describing obedience, he says, but in obedience there is joy and peace unspotted, unalloyed. And as God has designed our happiness and the happiness of all his creatures, he never will institute an ordinance or give a commandment to his people that is not calculated in its nature to promote that happiness which he has designed, and which will not end in the greatest amount of good and glory to those who become the recipients of his laws and ordinances. And I'll refer you to the rest of the happiness letter. But continuing with our essay, claiming that polygamy is unfair and emotionally cruel by its very nature, which we all know it is, directly contradicts what Joseph Smith claimed in this letter, that God will never institute a commandment or ordinance that is by its nature unjust or designed to promote unhappiness or unfairness. At LDS.org, they write, God is just, true, and righteous in all things. The problem with Hales is that they're not Mormon authorities. They're simply apologists who promote irrational arguments to defend Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy. What they claim directly contradicts what Joseph Smith taught, that happiness is the object and design of our existence and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it. A foundational Mormon theological concept is that men and women are born on earth that they might experience joy. The Book of Mormon declares Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy. 2 Nephi 2:25. How can one pursue the path to happiness when forced to live a principle that, according to Brian Hales, is by design unfair and emotionally cruel? This makes little sense theologically or otherwise. As Milton R. Hunter taught to a general conference in 1954, I believe with all my heart that God the Eternal Father wants his children on this earth to have joy, an abundance of joy. I believe also that he expects members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we who have taken upon ourselves the name of Christ, to live an abundant, joyful, happy life. Our lives should be lived in such a way as to bring us a fullness of joy today, tomorrow, next week, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, and even through the eternities. I want to remind each of us that God has placed within the reach of the members of the Church of Jesus Christ the possibility of that joy, that perpetual and eternal joy, if we will just obey the laws that bring that joy into our lives. This is Mormon doctrine, not the invented doctrine of Brian Hales. How does a practice that is emotionally cruel and unfair at its core bring joy into the lives of those that are commanded to practice it? In the end, was polygamy joy? Not for the vast majority of women involved in it, along with many of the men. It may have been joyful to those men who could discard their women at will, like Brigham Young and Joseph Smith, as he did with the Partridge Sisters and others, but not for everyone else that was forced to live the principle or pay a hefty $10 divorce fee that Brigham Young charged. Most of them looked at it as an unpleasant duty to their religion. There were many cases, for example, of men who married more than one woman and then refused to live with any but one, their favorite, and they were condemned for it. Even marriage, according to the Apostle Paul, should never get in the way of the gospel, so he admonished those who were single to stay so, even as he was. But that if you felt the need to be married, do so. Even Paul claimed that those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. Yet Joseph gave polygamy as a commandment, not an option, as Paul does with marriage. Hale's theological argument about polygamy makes little sense if one looks back historically at the practice. What does the importance of polygamy in eternity have to do with why Joseph Smith and other church leaders would inflict so much emotional damage on those they commanded to practice it on earth? What sense does it make for God to command it on earth if, according to Hales, the focus is for the eternities, or for monogamous eternal sealings? We know why, as both Joseph Smith and Brigham Young taught, it was to raise up righteous seed. Hales quotes Brigham Young in an effort to show that polygamy was instituted as some kind of trial. Quoting Brigham Young, I foresaw when Joseph first made known this doctrine that it would be a trial and a source of great care and anxiety to the brethren, and what of that? We are to gird up our loins and fulfill this just as we would any other duty. Yet Young also said in the same speech, this revelation which God gave to Joseph was for the express purpose of providing a channel for the organization of tabernacles, for those spirits to occupy who have been reserved to come forth in the kingdom of God. But for Brigham Young, the answer to those who might be discontented was simple. Hey, Yu-Gi-Oh, I'm trying to do something here. Calm down. Quoting Brigham Young, Sisters, do you wish to make yourselves happy? Then what is your duty? It is for you to bear children. Are you tormenting yourselves by thinking that your husbands do not love you? I would not care whether they loved a particle or not, but I would cry out like one of old, in the joy of my heart, I have got a man from the Lord. Hallelujah, I am a mother. For many women, this was not happiness, although some looked back on their hard lives living with polygamy and will 32, time and eternity, and this applies to patriarchal marriage as well as the monogamous ones. Hales claims that the critics ignore his claim that within the context of Joseph Smith's teachings, a few eternal polygamists are needed. What exactly is a few? Hales doesn't explain. That the sealing power was all about what was bound on earth would be bound in heaven is self-evident. That this also applies to marriage was the revelation of Joseph Smith to the Mormons in Nauvoo. Hales claims that polygamy is also part of the restoration of all things, but then cannot adequately explain why it was discontinued as a practice, given all the statements by Joseph's disciples who carried on with it after the Nauvoo period. Hales writes, quote, "Polygamy isn't fair on earth, but according to Joseph Smith's theology, every man and every woman must have a spouse in order to be exalted. The promise is that they shall inherit thrones, kingdoms, principalities, yada, 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 yada. Then there shall they be gods and have all power, and the angels are subject unto them. If we believe this promise, then the need for eternal plural sealings becomes more easy to embrace. My experience is that instead people just roll their eyes and rant about earthly polygamy, but in doing so, I think they may denigrate the polygamous women of the 19th century who practiced it for that reason because it was commanded. God commanded it according to the early prophets. Can we call it damnable? I guess it's a faith thing." That's the end of Hale's quote. Easy for whom to embrace? Those who, for whatever reason, are compelled to defend polygamy, for sure, yet the argument isn't about polygamy in heaven, but on earth, and why it was necessary and commanded to be practiced on earth. Hales offers no rational answers here, only that it is a faith thing. One can say that everything is a trial for some, but the object and design of the plan of salvation, according to Mormon theology, is that we are here to experience joy. Why then would polygamy really be necessary on earth if God can assign righteous women to men in the afterlife? And both Jeremy and I are not denigrating the polygamous wives. We are criticizing the practice and those who instigated it, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. There is no passage in the Bible where God commands polygamy, but he does command any future king of Israel not to practice it. From Deuteronomy, you shall not return that way again, neither shall he have multiple wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. From 1 Kings, his wives turn away his heart after other gods. The promise of the celestial kingdom is for all who live righteously, even children who never get married. So what makes polygamy necessary on earth except for the raising up of righteous seed? This is never adequately answered by Hales, given the above. Hales also writes, quote, "Perhaps another point is that those close to Joseph were just as skeptical as you and me. I've often said Fawn Brodie did a hatchet job. He wasn't that smart, and Brigham, Eliza Zina, and John Taylor were not that gullible. Recently, Alex Beam said Joseph's hypocrisy was breathtaking. How ridiculous. Beam can detect breathtaking hypocrisy 170 years later that none of the Nauvoo polygamists apparently detected, because if they had seen any hypocrisy, they would have left Joseph." That's the end of Hale's quote. The only hatchet job being done here is by Hales against the critics of polygamy and Joseph Smith. Then he claims in a subsequent comment, Hales again, "There's no doubt that plural marriage was taught as necessary for exaltation between the 1840s and 1890. It was required for exaltation for those Latter-day Saints during that span. However, I've not found any statement that unequivocally declares that all men in the upper degree of the celestial kingdom are polygamists, irrespective of the time and place they lived. God issues specialized commandments. Abraham had to live the law of circumcision. The children of Israel lived the law of Moses. LDS between the 1840s and 1890, polygamy. God knows why, but he never told us why. Joseph F. Smith explained it best. However, toward the beginning of the talk, Joseph Smith clarified, it, meaning plural marriage, is a principle that it pertains to eternal life. In other words, to endless lives or eternal increase. It is a law of the gospel pertaining to the celestial kingdom, applicable to all gospel dispensations, when commanded and not otherwise, and neither acceptable to God or binding on man unless given by commandment. Not only so given in this dispensation, but particularly adapted to the conditions and necessities thereof, and to the circumstances, responsibilities, and personal as well as vicarious duties of the people of God in this age of the world. God has revealed it as a principle. Joseph F. Smith outlines that it can be commanded or not commanded. It is not a law because it didn't exist in the Book of Mormon. This is certain based upon the text. Fundamentalists like to quote a few excerpts and then believe their sealings are valid, but God saw this day, and authority is paramount. In yet another comment, Hales claims, polygamy is not always commanded, and it hasn't been, according to the Bible and Book of Mormon. I think that conclusion is historical, but neither do I find a quote saying, every man in the celestial kingdom will be a polygamist. Do you have one? And that's the end of Hales' quotes. Actually, we do have one. Brigham Young said, Quote, "It is not polygamy that men fight when they persecute this people, but still, if we continue to be faithful to our God, he will defend us in doing what is right. If it is wrong for a man to have more than one wife at a time, the Lord will reveal it by and by, and he will put it away that it will not be known in the church. I did not ask him for a revelation upon this subject. When that revelation was first read to me by Joseph Smith, I plainly saw the great trials and the abuse of it that would be made by many of the elders, and the trouble and persecution it would bring upon this whole people. But the Lord revealed it, and it was my business to accept it. Now, we as Christians desire to be saved in the kingdom of God. We desire to attain to the possession of all the blessings that there are for the most faithful man or people that ever lived on the face of the earth, even him who is said to be the father of the faithful, Abraham of old. We wish to obtain all that Father Abraham obtained. I wish here to say to the elders of Israel and to all members of this church and kingdom that it is in the hearts of many of them to wish that the doctrine of polygamy was not taught and practiced to us. It may be hard for many, and especially the ladies, yet it is no harder for them than it is for the gentlemen. It is the word of the Lord. And I wish to say to you and all the world that if you desire with all your hearts to obtain the blessings which Abraham obtained, you will be polygamists, at least in your faith. Or you will who wish that there were no such thing in existence, if you have in your heart to say to us, we will not, therefore, be polygamists, lest we should fail in obtaining some earthly honor, character, and office, etc. The man that has this in his heart and will continue to persist in pursuing that policy will come short of dwelling in the presence of the Father and the Son in celestial glory. The only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. Others attain unto a glory and may even be permitted to come into the presence of the Father and the Son, but they cannot reign as kings in glory because they had blessings offered to them and they refused to accept them. The Lord gave a revelation through Joseph Smith, his servant, and we have believed. And it is said that this must be done away before we are permitted to receive our place as a state in the Union. It may be, or it may not be. If one of the twin relics, slavery, they say, is abolished, I do not, however, wish to speak about this. But if slavery and oppression and iron-handed cruelty are not more felt by the blacks today than before, I am glad of it. My heart is pained for that unfortunate race of men. One twin relic having been strangled, the other, they say, must next be destroyed. It is they and God for it, for you will all find that out. It is not Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and Daniel H. Wells and the elders of Israel they are fighting against, but it is the Lord Almighty. What is the Lord going to do? He is going to do just as he pleases, and the world cannot help themselves. I heard the revelation on polygamy, and I believe it with all my heart, and I know it is from God. I know that he revealed it from heaven. I know that it is true and understand the bearings of it and why it is. Do you think we shall ever be admitted as a state into the Union without denying the principle of polygamy? If we are not admitted until then, we shall never be admitted. These things will be just as the Lord will. Let us live to take up what he sends us, and when our enemies rise up against us, we will meet them as we can, and exercise faith and pray for wisdom and power more than they have, and contend continually for the right. Go along, my children, saith the Lord, do all you can, and remember that your blessings come through your faith. Be faithful and cut through the corners of your enemies where you can. Get the advantage of them by faith and good works. Take care of yourselves, and they will destroy themselves. Be what you should be, live as you should, and all will be well. That's the end of that lengthy quote from Brigham Young. Now, Mormon apologists claim that this quote is always taken out of context. Well, here's the whole quote in context. Young claims that if polygamy is wrong, the Lord would reveal it, and then it would be put away and not known in the church. Well, did this happen? No. Has the principle of polygamy ever been considered or taught as wrong? No. Do men still have more than one wife at the same time in the church? Yes, if their wife dies and they marry again for eternity. So it's not really been put away, has it? Is this practice still known in the church? Yes, it is. Young never believed that polygamy would be revoked. What he predicted about statehood came to pass, and in Young's prophetic mind, this condemned the church. His prophetic warning that only those that possessions. What Smith died for, what Young left the United States for, and what John Taylor went into hiding for was thrown aside so that the church could integrate with the nation and disregard the doctrine of the gathering, something anathema to all those former prophets. It was the failure of those prophecies by Smith, Young, and Taylor that led to Woodruff's compromise. Their enemies did not destroy themselves. We have statements by Joseph F. Smith given when there was no first presidency, therefore authoritative as coming from the ruling body of the church, who claimed that none would be exalted to thrones without practicing polygamy, because those who did deserved it more. That quote, "If then this principle was of such great importance that the prophet himself was threatened with destruction, and the best men in the church with being excluded from the favor of the Almighty if they did not enter into and establish the practice of it on the earth, it is useless to tell me that there is no blessing attached to obedience to the law, or that a man with only one wife can obtain as great a reward, glory, or kingdom as he can with more than one, being equally faithful. Patriarchal marriage involves conditions, responsibilities, and obligations which do not exist in monogamy. There are blessings attached to the faithful observance of that law, if viewed only upon natural principles, which must so far exceed those of monogamy as the conditions, responsibilities, and power of increase are greater. This is my view and testimony in relation to this matter. I believe it is a doctrine that should be taught and understood." Has the Lord ever revealed that it was wrong for a man to have more wife than one at the same time? Since the days of Joseph, not what Wilford Woodruff did. He stopped the practice of having two living wives at the same time. He did not declare the principle wrong. He was afraid they would take away the property of the church and that the leaders would go to jail. In a speech in 1891, he explained, and this is now Wilford Woodruff, "Question is this: which is the wisest course for the Latter-day Saints to pursue, to continue to attempt to practice plural marriage of all the ordinances therein, both for the living and the dead, and the imprisonment of the first presidency and the 12s and the head of the families in the church, and the confiscation of personal property of the people, all of which themselves would stop the practice, or after doing and suffering what we have through our adherence to this principle, to cease the practice and submit to the law, and through doing so leave the prophets and apostles and fathers at home, so they can instruct the people and attend to the duties of the church, and also leave the temples in the hands of the saints, so that they can attend to the ordinances of the gospel, both for the living and the dead." You see, Woodruff chose the United States over God. Just a year earlier, Woodruff already had a, quote, revelation, quote, concerning the course to take with polygamy. According to Abraham H. Cannon, this is, I think, from Cannon's journal, Thursday, December 19th, during our meeting, a revelation was read, which President Woodruff received Sunday evening, November 24th. Propositions had been made for the church to make some concessions to the courts in regards to its principles. Both of President Woodruff's counselors refused to advise him as to the course he should pursue, and he therefore laid the matter, but became quick and strong. "The word of the Lord was for us when we were in the line of our duty. We are promised redemption and deliverance if we will trust in God and not the arm of the flesh. We were admonished to pray often. The whole revelation was filled with words of the greatest encouragement and comfort, and my heart was filled with joy and peace during the entire reading. It sets all doubts at rest concerning the course claims to have received from God." Wilford's previous revelation reads as follows, and it's quoted here. Time in our reading here will say the most salient parts are when God revealed, "Let not my servants who are called to the presidency of my church deny my word or my law. Place not yourselves in jeopardy to your enemies by promise. Let my servants, who as they are moved upon by the Holy Spirit without any further pledges from the priesthood." And let's see here. "Let mine anointed gird up their loins, watch and be sober, and keep my commandments and exercise faith." I'll let you read the whole of the statement, which included a scenario he believed would never happen, and it didn't. But what did happen was that Wilford Woodruff submitted to the U.S. government, disobeyed a previous revelation from God to do so, and did just what Brigham Young prophetically counseled not to do. There are many statements by Joseph the talents applied to polygamy that are taken away and given to someone who has more. Hales simply ignores this strong evidence. In fact, according to the statement by Brigham Young quoted above, Wilford Woodruff abolished the practice of polygamy on earth for just the reasons he counseled against: pressure from the United States government. Young declared that the breaking up of the community was an invalid reason for not practicing polygamy, the very reason Woodruff gave for forbidding the practice of it. Brigham Young stated that if the Lord would stop polygamy, he would declare it wrong or an abomination, as in the Book of Mormon. There has been no revelation at all that polygamy is wrong. In fact, Mormons still practice polygamy when they marry someone for eternity after their first wife dies. Is that considered wrong? They say no. They still have 2 wives at the same time, do they not? Death does not break the marriage covenant in Mormonism. If you are a polygamist in your faith, then you would practice it. This is what Young meant by that comment. It is the same as baptism. If you only believe in baptism and don't submit to it and practice it, it does you no good. Does it not make sense to say that if you desire with all your heart to gain entrance into the kingdom of God, the blessing associated with baptism, you will be baptized, at least in your faith, and have this mean that baptism is somehow not essential? Young expressly states, "You who wish that there were no such thing in existence," well, it goes on just to quote what we've read already regarding the fact that you have to practice it if you believe in it. Young is explicitly stating that one cannot avoid entering into polygamy because there was no good reason to do so. Notice how Young couples the concept together, without obeying or submitting to it in our faith or believing this order. How can one submit and obey a practice if they do not believe it? Refusing to obey and submit to it, therefore practice it, is the same as disbelieving it. Young never taught that it was all right not to obey and submit to commandments. If one did fail to enter into the practice, it was for obtaining some earthly honor, character, or office. What sense to say all this if one could simply say, "Oh, I believe in the practice in my faith, I just don't have to practice it, and I'll get the same blessings as those who do obey and enter again"? Again, it would be like Young claiming that one could obtain the blessings of baptism only by believing in it. Like baptism, patriarchal marriage was called the New and Everlasting Covenant. D&C 22:1 regarding baptism, "Behold, I say unto you that all covenants have I caused to be done away in this thing," meaning baptism, "and this is a new and everlasting covenant, even that which was from the beginning." And then we see the term new and everlasting covenant again used in reference to marriage. D&C 132, "For behold, I reveal unto you a new and an everlasting covenant," which is celestial marriage, including the plurality of wives. "If ye abide not that covenant, then ye are damned. For no one can reject this covenant and be permitted to enter into my glory." In 1868, Young stated that you take a woman in the church who does not believe in the doctrine of celestial marriage or plurality of wives, and she does not believe anything at all about the gospel, and she will soon manifest this by her unwise course, and by she drops off and away she goes. But our sisters believe and know that this doctrine is true, and consequently they feel bound to abide it. End of quote. They believe it in their hearts, so they feel bound to abide or comply with it, to practice it. This is the stated purpose of the new and everlasting covenant, to obtain every blessing that God offers, and why Smith claimed there was to be a restoration of all things that would continue until the coming of Christ. Young then claims that only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. Others attain unto a glory and may even be permitted to come into the presence of the Father and the Son, but they cannot reign as kings in glory because they had blessings offered to them and they refused to accept them. By following Woodruff's manifesto, Mormons rejected the blessing of polygamy, yet God still offers the blessing of polygamy in section 132. Has he said he does not? This part of the quote makes no sense at all if Brigham Young was claiming that polygamy could be tossed aside because the United States government said so. This is the very problem that fundamentalist Mormons have with the manifesto. And this is why Young taught that the Lord instituted polygamy to raise up a royal priesthood, a kingdom of the priest. It is an institution of heaven. All blessings that are sealed upon us will do us no good unless we live for them. Why do we believe in and practice polygamy? Asked Brigham Young. Because the Lord introduced it to his servants in a revelation, and the Lord's servants have always practiced it. And it is that religion popular in heaven? It is the only popular religion there, for this is the religion of Abraham, and unless we do the works of Abraham, we are not Abraham's seed and heirs according to promise. Hale's claiming that the critics don't understand or address Joseph's theology is simply another red herring. And that's the end of part 2. Wow. Okay, that was a long one. All right. Well, I think, we could probably take a call or two if somebody wants to share their thoughts about what we read here. This was really an examination starting from some of the criticisms of Hale's conclusions that other respected historians have, in particular Michael D. Quinn and Dan Vogel, and contrasting that with how Hales treats Jeremy Runnels in his own discussions about polygamy. So if you want to join the conversation, you can call 210-422-2222. Let's see. Yu-Gi-Oh, what are you up to? All right. So let's see here. If you call that, we should be able to bring you in. Let's see what comments we've had. I can't believe anyone's still awake. You're probably going to have to take this like in a series of sessions. I don't know if anyone can actually sit through this all in one go. All right, let's see what we got. Let's see here. James Conger, I can remember the way Brian Hales acted with Bill Reel over an episode of Bill Reel's Mormon Discussions where he considered the idea that Angel with a Flaming Sword might be from the devil. Hales told Bill Reel that he would burn all of his Mormon Discussions t-shirts and was going to talk to his stake president. That was very childish. Well, you have to remember that Bill Reel started out kind of as a defender of the church and Joseph Smith, and he was invited to come and give stake firesides because he was able to frame the history of the church and the criticisms of the church in a way that maintained faith. And so he would have been considered aligned with Brian Hales because that's one of the things that Hales has dedicated his work to do. But as soon as somebody steps out of that paradigm, as Bill Reel did, because if you follow Bill Reel, he's evolved in his position. He used to accept certain arguments and conclusions about the church in defending of Joseph Smith, but as he learned more, as he educated himself more about the nature of religious manipulation and came to accept some of the undeniable conclusions of a review of the historical document, he started to see the church and Joseph Smith in a different light and started to be vocal about that. So it's understandable that someone in Hale's position would be critical of that. I agree, though, that when you saying that you're going to burn all the Mormon Discussion t-shirts, it's a little bit childish, but it's effective. Metaphorically speaking, he's basically saying that he's washing his hands of Bill Reel and he'll no longer consider him a colleague in defending the faith. And I don't think Bill would argue that he should be seen as a colleague in that regard. Bill is more centered on allowing people to reclaim and build their own autonomy for their lives from the perspective of their own moral prism, rather from one that's handed to them by men claiming religious authority. Okay, so somebody says, didn't Brigham Young also say that some men were choosing the pretty babes and leaving them with the ugly ones? Now, I don't think it was Brigham Young said that, but there was an early general in England. They would convert a bunch of people, get them all on a boat, and then bring them back to Nauvoo. And on the way, they find the cute girls and go ahead and marry them on the way, so that when they get there to Nauvoo and everybody's coming off the boat and the men are like, who's going to be my good second wife or whatever. Actually, this may have been the Utah period rather than that, but it's the same principle and idea that they'd find the cute ones and then be like, oh, they're already married to one of the missionaries who's coming. And so they said, from now on, you can't marry any of the converts till you get to Utah so that we can all have a good shot at them. And that's that there is a quote about that. It's entertaining from one perspective and sad from another, because it really kind of treats the women like chattel. All right, it's the phone number is 210-422-2222 if you'd like to share your thoughts on what we've talked about today. When she talks about rooming with Smith as man and wife, I think that's true, but I think that testimony in particular was talking, primarily about a just conventional polygamy, not polyandry. And that was used really as an example to show that, in certain circumstances, women did acknowledge the very real sexual dimension of their relationships. And so that was, you just compare that with the testimonies given by, I think, Eliza, where she was just very confrontational and she did not like to share too much of that. Okay, let's see here. In a just world, if polyandry is immoral, then so is polygyny, unless you believe women are worth less than men. This is an excellent point, because if we're going through all of this effort to try to, exclude Joseph from the category of polyandry. No, it's not polyandry. It's not polyandry. Polygamy itself, just on its own, is immoral and denigrates women. And so what you're doing is, in trying to protect Joseph Smith from polyandry but defend polygamy, you're still defending a practice that completely commoditizes women and is unjust and deplorable, regardless of what religious framework you can have to defend it. And it's so interesting to read how much reliance Brian Hales puts on, no, you can't just criticize polygamy as a practice because he had a religious theological explanation for it that guaranteed salvation and promised all of these great things. Well, if you go and you look at all of the different religionists who compelled their followers to engage in unorthodox sexual practices and marriage arrangements, every one of these religionists did so with a theological justification. That's how you get people to go against their conventional morality, is you take advantage and leverage their devotion to the theology. And so when you read about David Koresh, he did the same thing Joseph Smith did. He said, well, all of your prior marriage covenants are invalid, which makes you now available to me if you're a woman in my congregation. And that was the justification. Well, it's done exactly the same in principally when Joseph Smith says, well, God invalidates all prior covenants, and so you're free to marry somebody else. Oh, and an angel told me that you have to marry me. It's unethical, it's immoral, it's spiritual coercion, and the fact that it's the foundation of these polygamous relationships is inherently and fundamentally wrong, regardless if you're talking about polyandry or polygamy. Okay. Let's see here. Brian Hales has made it his life's work to minimize and normalize Joseph's sexually predatory behavior. It's disgusting and heartbreaking, particularly when you understand that Hales is defending an organization that has done great harm to his own family member. I don't know anything about Hales' personal family situation, but I agree that the efforts of the arguments that he brings forth tend to have the effect of minimizing and excusing behavior that if we saw anybody else in any other religious organization do, we'd say that behavior alone, and attributing it to God, is the very definition of spiritual coercion, religious manipulation, that somebody who clearly has the purposes of exploiting his followers for the purpose of control, sexual gratification, and power, it's so obvious. And yet when you look at Joseph Smith, then you can say, oh, well, his theology sublimates something that would otherwise is excusing atrocities, excusing the inexcusable. All right. One of the viewers says, I had an ancestor whose husband abandoned her and 8 kids financially when he got a young wife, and she survived with silkworms. This was not a terribly uncommon thing. Brigham Young, even in his own practice, when you read of the history of his wives, there's like a little cultural phenomenon within and among the sister wives where the new wife tends to be the young, attractive, pretty one, and Brigham Young or whichever patriarch in the family will then devote all of their emotional time and other resources to the new bride until there is a newer bride that comes along, and that just is like a mill or a cycle. And maybe there's one bride that, just because of the power and strength of her personality, and there's a stronger connection with them, that bride kind of closes and seals the deal, or continues to be a primary source of interest and affection. But it's going to be different dependent on the people involved in the polygamous relationship. But no matter how it goes, what it ends up doing is just as Hales acknowledged, it ends up limiting the sexual access, the emotional resources, the financial and just conventional support that would exist in any monogamous marriage, because it's now diffused over multiple women. And you can find heartbreaking stories of women who were essentially abandoned as their spouse went on to devote more of their emotional and material resources to the newer, younger bride. And it's very, very sad. And the fact that this is then attributed and justified to God by defenders of Joseph Smith, because they have to keep him in the space of a worthy prophet, because him being a worthy prophet is what justifies the entire existence of the church, then you end up throwing all of these women under the bus headed by Joseph Smith, because he's kept protected in that space. And it's really hard to look charitably on men like Brian Hales who do this, and you'll find women who also do it. And it's for the same reason. You have to maintain worthy prophet as a heading for Joseph Smith. And when you see people that do that, it just, once you step away from the church and you allow yourself to acknowledge that these things were abusive and harmful, and they are a dark chapter in the history of America and the history of the church and in the history of women, then seeing people defend and justify that just really, really gets under your skin. And I think you can feel a little bit that in how Jeremy Reynolds and Johnny Stevensons are responding to Hales. It's hard to keep a cool head, just as it's hard to keep a cool head for, I think, people trying to defend Joseph Smith. These are things that are close to your moral center. For believers, keeping Joseph Smith as a worthy prophet is very close to their moral center, and so they get very passionate in their defense of it, and that passion bleeds over into ad hominem, into accepting double standards for evidence. And I think for people on the other side, seeing the disenfranchisement and the abuse and the neglect of women is very close to their moral center, because we see that as a unjust atrocity, and then that inspires the passion that we have for speaking out against it. And I think that's even more powerful in this particular cultural moment in humanity's history, where we have things like the recent Me Too movement, where you have people who before have been disbelieved because their accusations were levied against men of power in our community. People like Harvey Weinstein, like other politicians, and people in positions of influence and power. In decades in history past, if a woman came out and said, "This was done to me," people would say, "Well, there's no evidence to prove it. You're just trying to get a name for yourself." But now we're starting to realize that those abuses are so commonplace, and the power dynamics make it so possible for that to happen, that you realize that the women coming out with these accusations, for the most part, are being honest and truthful. And the men that have enjoyed those positions of power are starting to see that they are against them. Well, we're at that gestalt now, even in looking back on Mormon church history, and we start to see the people who would defend Joseph Smith in the same light that we would see people who try to defend and excuse Harvey Weinstein or some of the other people like that. It's just really lamentable. All right, well, I think we will go ahead and close it down for today. We didn't get any calls. That's okay, though, and we'll see if part 3 is just as compelling. I tried to avoid going into the footnotes this time because I didn't realize they were like insanely long articles. I sent a note to Johnny Stevenson and said, "Dude, you need to break this up more, because nobody's going to read this if it's so long," and I think he's aware of that limitation of this stuff. But let's go ahead and close it for today. And until tomorrow, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. Take care.